Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's event, which is the second annual symposium, Impact Symposium of the UCLA Initiative to Study Hate. My name is David Myers, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's event, which really marks an important point in the history of the initiative, the end of our first three-year pilot project. Let me offer just a few words about the history of the project, for those of you who may not be so familiar with it. We began in 2022 as an initiative whose mission was to understand hate in response to an exponential rise in hate incidents and expressions, especially since the year 2015. And the original idea was not to focus on a particular group or individual, but rather to study hate as it took rise in individuals as a class and in groups, not a particular group, but the idea of hate-based expression in groups. And over the course of our first 3 years, we had a very productive time. There are varying accounts of how many research teams we supported that ranged from 42 to 73. So somewhere, depending on your accounting method, you can get a sense of the scale of this initiative. What we do know is that we have supported over 115 researchers from around campus, ranging from undergraduates to senior faculty members. The ISH research community, which has really been built up over 3 years, draws on members from over 20 disciplines and departments. And we think it's really one of the largest concentrations of scholars in the world studying hate. In the wake of October 7th, 2023, we decided to revisit the original organizing principle, which was to focus on groups and individuals rather than a specific group, by creating a new research hub to study anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and related forms of identity-based hate. And that added another 20 or so members to the ISH fold. ISH, by the way, is the acronym that we use for the Initiative to Study Hate. It takes a while to get used to it, but once you do, you'll be able to vibe with it. Our original funding will last us through the next academic year, and we will be planning the future of ISH thereafter. One very salutary development is that as of this year, the Initiative to Study Hate came under the umbrella of the Bidari Kindness Institute, which is an institute that has existed for 5 years on campus, that is now home, the administrative home to ISH, as well as the Dialogue Across Difference initiative, and which presents really very interesting and exciting opportunities for collaboration, because we believe that the study of hate and the study of kindness exist on an interesting research methodological spectrum. And in fact, we've seen in our first call for researchers for the Bidari Kindness Institute of this year that there's some considerable measure of overlap between those interested in the study of these two phenomena. So the study of hate will continue at UCLA. Under this new administrative rubric, which we're really delighted about. What we do know after 3 years is that hate is too important a subject to neglect, and that in our 3 years, we've made important progress, but have not altogether solved the problem of hate in society. What have we done in our time? We've conducted cutting-edge research that understands hate through the lenses of neuroscience, computer science, social media research, political science, anthropology, mathematics, musicology, psychiatry, and many other disciplines. We have brought people from these various disciplines together on a monthly basis in a seminar to share ideas, methods, and research findings. We have, owing to the hard work of Naomi Taub, a blog that summarizes important research conducted by ISH, which I encourage you all to take a look at. It to be found on our website, studyofhate.ucla.edu. We have created, due to the hard work of a team of our researchers this year, a rapid response tool to combat mis and disinformation surrounding the wildfires in Los Angeles from January 2025. And we are now in the midst of launching a survey to gauge attitudes about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia at UCLA to learn better how to combat those phenomena. A lot of what we've done this year is to focus on mitigation strategies because we think it's important to conduct really significant research, and it's equally important to translate it into tangible outcomes, mitigation strategies, takeaways. And that really is a guiding theme at this year's symposium. So we're going to have 3 panels featuring ISH researchers, each of which will be between 50 to 60 minutes. At the end of the 3 hours together, we will have a reception to which everybody's invited. There will be breaks after each session, but feel free to stand up and step out as needed. So before we begin with our first panel, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank those generous donors who have understood the import of our work and have made it possible, particularly the Anthony and Jean Pritzker Foundation. And I'd also like to extend my very deep gratitude to my cherished, beloved colleagues at ISH. I really have the privilege to be able to work with some of the very best people on campus, or really in the world, on some of the most important work that is being done at UCLA. And that work can be draining, as those of you who are engaged in research on hate know. So I want to begin by thanking our indefatigable research manager, Dr. Maya Mora, who is the chief architect of today's symposium and has really done the heaviest logistical lift to get us here. Thank you so much. I also want to thank, I hope she's here. Is Lisa here? Because I'm going to call her out in a second. Okay. Our stupendous graduate student researcher and PhD candidate, Felicia Graham, who is preternaturally wise in matters of the soul and the mind. Is she here? She's outside. Okay, all right. Well, and also outside I see, hey. I just said nice words about you. And I want to thank our financial whiz, who is definitely outside, sitting right at the desk, Maria Patlan, who is preternaturally wise in matters of budget. Thank you, Maria. And last but not least, my very close partner, Maya Ferdman, who assures that everything at ISH, Dialogue Across Difference, and the Bedari Kindness Institute works as well as it does. Thank you, Maya, for all that you do. And with that, I'd like to now call up the first panel to begin the conversation about extremist recruitment from point of entry to exit.
Hi, everybody. While we're getting set up, we'll just quickly do a quick introduction. So I'm Howard Padua. I'm a former historian, current health services researcher in the psychiatry department. I've had the privilege of working with ISH for all 3 years of the initiative. My first project looked at hatred as it impacted people experiencing homelessness. And my second project, which is still ongoing, is looking at hatred on social media, something we'll be talking about a bunch today. So with that, I think we'll start by just getting to know our panelists a little bit. So I'll hand things off to each of you. Maybe just say a quick hello, who you are, and what your research here at ISH is.
Hi everyone, I am Bethan Johnson. I'm a postdoctoral fellow with ISH, and my work has focused on understanding particularly white supremacy and white identity politics across the sort of Anglophone world, let's say. I'm a trained historian, but I count history as anything that's happened in the past up till right now, so.
My name is Aaron Panofsky. I am a professor at UCLA in the Institute for Society and Genetics and the Department of Public Policy. My ISH-related research focuses on the use and misuse of science in especially white nationalists, but in identity-based political arenas. And part of the ways that the many sort of political and scientific functions that those take.
Hi everyone, my name is Lu Wei Ying. I am an assistant professor of political science at UCLA. My research looks at violent extremism around the world. In particular, I look at how extremist groups propagate certain ideologies to engage people into their extremist and violent network. Thank you, everybody.
As you can see, we didn't rehearse the mic passing, so apologies for that. So what we're gonna do is talk a little, we have a second mic. See, they do think of everything. David was right. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna get to hear a little bit from each of our esteemed researchers about their projects. Then we're gonna follow up with a little bit of structured discussion, and then seeing how it goes, we can open that discussion up with everyone else as well. So as you can see, the discussion of extremist recruitment from point of entry to exit. The reason we're looking at this is because this is what we think when we think white nationalism. These are the folks we think of. However, something that Bethan put together to show us is these are also the faces of white nationalism. These are faces of youth who have been found to be involved in extremist violent activities. And what's striking for me is, I have an 8-year-old and a 12-year-old, and I am a little scared of my 12-year-old, but not like this. And these guys look a lot like the kids in my 12-year-old school. So it's really, really shocking for me. So a lot of what we're gonna talk about today is the question of how do our kids become involved in these things? What is it that happens, and what are some of the entryways to it? And as we're gonna start, when we hear from Aaron and Louise, especially to begin with, a lot of this has to do with social media, as we would expect. I'm a historian, a bit of a Luddite. There's nothing I dislike that I can't blame on social media. However, one thing that we'll also learn from Bethan is that this is something that predates social media and is baked into the DNA of right-wing extremism. So this is what we're going to be talking about. So with that, I think I'd like to start with just a quick question for Bethan. So Bethan, let's say we're in an elevator that's going 100 stories. We have 2 minutes in the elevator. Give me your elevator speech. What do we mean by right-wing extremism?
Great. Well, I have to go really slowly. So right-wing extremism essentially is an entirely subjective concept. Oh, am I doing this wrong? Okay, well, the elevator had a little emergency stop in the middle there. But basically, when we talk about right-wing extremism, that in itself is a highly politicized term that gets used by many different people. So always ask, if you ever find yourself confronted with someone that says they study this, say, what do you mean by that? Who counts as that? Because other people prefer to use terms like racially or ethnically motivated violence, REMV, if you ever hear that. But generally speaking, when people are talking about right-wing terrorism, right-wing extremism, it has a lot to do with these ideas around supremacy. So that could be, for instance, white supremacy, or it could be male supremacy, or it could be Christian supremacy. These are kind of interlocking ideologies within the right-wing space, which is the idea that you can classify people based on the group identity with which they are affiliated, and then they can be ranked somehow as inferior or superior. Often we see that also not just replicated in a kind of social sense, like, oh, I think I'm superior to you, or vice versa. It's that in addition to that social structure, the political and economic structures should reflect that as well. So the idea of only Christians should govern the United States, for instance, is part of Christian nationalism, or male supremacy, the idea of like disenfranchising female voters because they are women, are parts of right-wing extremism. But we have to be careful because right-wing extremism can include things that are not often discussed, like I would count, for instance, instance, abortion clinic bombings might be counted, but that might not be counted by someone else. So more than anything in my elevator, I'd say ask more questions and ask questions of us when we say this.
Right, great, thank you. And for the purposes of this panel, a lot of what we're talking about is kind of the white nationalist, Christian nationalist. So what we're talking about here doesn't apply to the other stripes. So with that said, let's go ahead and start with Louay. So we're gonna have each of our scholars share about 5 to 7 minutes of their research with us. So Louay, hand it away, and your slides are up here, or I can forward them if you like.
Awesome, thank you.
So just, here you go.
Perfect. So I guess I don't need to spend a lot of time to convince you that white nationalism is very, very problematic. If you look at the data in the United States, 3/4 of the total violent attacks were perpetrated by white nationalists. So we need to figure out why. And here I studied one research question, which is how do white nationalist leaders use ideological appeals to build and maintain the extremist community online. We all know that nobody was born as a white nationalism. They converted to be a white nationalist at some point. So we need to figure out first and foremost how. And to study that, we look at social media and we pay particular attention to the ideologies circulated on social media. And we look into 5 ideologies. We look at race, religion, and nationalism. So the name of this movement is called white nationalism. So obviously, race and nationalism is there. And in the Western culture, Christian ideology is tied with these white ideologies. So we have to put religion there as well. So we call these 3 the core ideas. And then we study partisanship and gender. Later we'll probably have more discussion on this. These 2 ideologies are kind of mainstream, but they play a very important role in this movement. I will show you in just a second. So how do we design the test? We look at social media, we scrape the data from Twitter and Gap. For those who don't know a lot about Gap, it's just a platform like Twitter, but favored by right-wing Westerners. And we find our data by locate the white nationalist leaders. They were identified by Southern Poverty Law Center, and we first find their online account and treat them as the seed account, and then we find who are following them, and we script the entire timeline of people who follows 6 or more of the leaders' account. And our data spans 5 years, and then we use some dictionary methods to measure the 5 themes I just talked about in these data. So let me just jump into the results. I think this is an empirical paper, so it's important to just go over our main findings. So first of all, I want to convince you that leaders play a very important role online. That's why they are called leaders. And how do we interpret this? So in the first panel, we see that when the leaders initiate a shift in topic, the followers really follows. So they have a very huge agenda setting power. But if we do the placebo test and see what if the followers initiate in the first place and try to talk something else, well, obviously the leaders don't follow them because they're the leaders. So that's why these big names are important. And second, we ask how different ideologies actually engage people into their network, or how different ideologies resonate differently among the people. So here we run a regression analysis with all these ideologies intact as the independent variable and the repost rate as the dependent variable. So how do we interpret this? We see a significant and positive effect in the panel of race and gender, but not others. So in the term that a general audience can understand, that would be when the leaders include racist ideas or gendered rhetoric in their post, then these posts are more popular. People are more likely to repost these posts. So when we first get these results, we're like, it kind of makes sense, but why? Why these two? The name of the movement is called white nationalist. Why don't we see white and nationalism, but white and gender? And here is the answer. We further break the previous analysis to see if there is a differential effect between the core followers and the peripheral followers. Again, they are measured by how many leaders' account they were followed. And we see that among the core followers, they're really white and nationalist because they really, really favor the racist and nationalist ideas or posts. But among peripheral followers, we see the same effects as the previous slides, which is they want the race idea, they want the gendered idea. Probably these ideas are more related to them. So they just jump in and say, yeah, I think people of color are bad, or women are bad, and that's something they were interested in. Okay, so what's the implication of this? Or what happened if we probe this idea even further? What happened when people started to favor the gendered idea? Well, one of the most important issues is that once people are engaged with the gendered idea, they become more radicalized on other spectrum as well. So we see that I highlighted the two bars. You see the x-axis is gender, the y-axis is race, meaning that when people see these gendered posts and they really agree with that, they like talking about how men should be supreme and how women at LGBTQ plus groups are bad. So they engage more with this community, and as a result, they also become more radicalized on other spectrum and later talk more racist, in a more racist way themselves. So this is what we mean by radicalization. This is the process of radicalization. They become better white nationalists, which means worse person. Well, similarly, we see an effect with the gateway effect of partisan nationalism, but just for transparency purposes, that effect is not very robust, meaning that if we tweak the model specification a little bit, we don't see the same effect. But the effect of gender on race ideology is very, very, very robust. And finally, this is just a descriptive analysis, but I think it has a lot of implications. So if we look at the co-occurrence between gender rhetoric and race rhetoric, we see it increased dramatically in the past 5 years. So the top line and the bottom line are race rhetoric and gender rhetoric by itself. Over time, they were pretty much stable. But if you see to what extent the gendered rhetoric has been racialized, you see it increased dramatically. What does that mean? So here's the examples. Previously, they would say gender is gender, race is race. And now when people talk about the gendered ideology, they say, is it so problematic because the white woman marry all group, and that has like a lot of implications downstream, and that's a huge threat, and therefore we need to do something or even kill. So that is the implication. I want to pause here, and we can talk more about this in just a second. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Roy. And I think it's really interesting. So, I mean, the two things that your work really highlights, and this is just a segue to you, Aaron, are going to be the central role of gender and discussions of gender and gender expectations almost as the gateway into white nationalism and racism, and then the way that kind of instantiates itself as scientific discourse, which is something that, Aaron, your work has looked at. So with that, we'll hand it off to you. And the next slide is you.
Thanks again, everyone, for coming here to listen to us talk about these important but disturbing topics. So this slide is kind of like a quick overview of what my project over the last few years has been about. I've been engaged in this sort of group online ethnographic research project that also has done some content analyses where you sort of take certain classes of online information and kind of code and classify it, and even a little bit of scientometric work, which is about sort of tracking the kinds of ideas that are influential within the scientific field. And what I'm really interested in is the recapitulation of scientific racism as a kind of citizen science project. And so this is my research team here, and especially Kushan Dasgupta was supported for a year by the ISH Fellowship, so that was really, really important to the project and to his progress as a scholar. And so what we're doing in this study is thinking about how science is engaged by these white nationalists, which, if you think about it, is actually a little bit counterintuitive. I mean, I think a lot of the historiography of white nationalists talks about the role of, sort of demographic changes, the role of the Vietnam War, and the when soldiers came back, and how that produced a kind of like a culture and political order of sort of discontent that fueled a lot of white nationalism. And in a lot of that historiography, I think like science is not that prominent. Maybe in an earlier era, the sort of eugenics era, the 20s, 30s, 40s, but in the sort of more contemporary second half of the 20th century, science and kind of rationalist discourse is not really been emphasized. So anyway, so these are kind of the three overarching research questions: which scientific ideas are engaged, how do they connect to political projects, and how do folks build authority for their kind of heterodox or non-normative claims. And so where I came into this project, and where I think, and one of the main gateways for science talk in white nationalist communities, was through the through genetic ancestry tests. So 23andMe, Ancestry.com, all these genetic tests where you can send $100 and a vial of spit off to a company, and they'll tell you something about who you are, where you came from, who your ancestors and sort of putative biological communities are. On the right here, you'll see a screenshot from an old, Twitter when it was Twitter, from Richard Spencer, right? The sort of 2015-16 white nationalist who gained a lot of prominence. And he, sort of says, here's my ancestry, according to 23andMe, and he sort of, shows his ostensibly white bona fides, right, in this tweet. And so this is a thing this is the first project that I did in this domain. And we tracked how engagers on the discussion board Stormfront, which is basically a white nationalist, white pride, longstanding, since 1996, discussion forum. And so we looked at the ways that they were discussing these ancestry test results, okay? And so one of the main motivations initially was for folks to supposedly confirm or maybe discover their white identity, right? So take a test. Oh, it turns out I thought I was Irish, but I also have Viking blood. I'm gonna get a Thor tattoo or something, right? So that was a big component. But the bigger part of our story in this paper was looking at the quote unquote bad news, right? So when people get news of some kind of ancestry that they're not so happy about, or they don't really understand what it is, how did they engage it? And to cut a very, very long story short, there are really sort of two styles. One is to dismiss the science and say, look, if you're a committed white nationalist, you don't need science to tell you. And besides, those companies are all run by a bunch of Jews who are trying to confuse the white race about their heritage. The other strategy, though, was to say, hey, these tests are real. The science tells us something, and now how do we deal with it? And so they would often then do these very complicated repair practices to sort of say, oh, well, the reason why you got this result that doesn't coincide is some historical phenomenon or some statistical problem or this and that. So they would kind of repair and explain away. But one of the things that was really interesting, and what launched the sort of broader project that I was interested in, is how this encouraged people to rethink the boundaries of whiteness, right? So if you look at, on Stormfront, these definitions of who is white, they would say something like, if you look white, you act white, you live with white people, and you have white relatives, then you're white, right? So it was more a qualitative, more like, if you live the lifestyle, that's how you know. But during, when people are debating these tests, though, they spend a lot of time talking about, well, what percentage is too much? Or which kinds of genes are really the bad ones to have? Is it all genes, or is it just some particular ones? So the discourse around the definition of whiteness started to conform to this scientized way of thinking about it, right? So not necessarily everyone, but there was a big discussion about science. And so that led me to start thinking more broadly about how science talk shows up in these communities. And so I want to just give a quick kind of overview of the kinds of things that we see in these ethnographies. So on the left, those two websites, we have Charles Murray, and then below that are sort of like far-right online magazines where they do a lot of basically right-wing science journalism, talking about race, genetics, demographics, criminology, focusing a lot on questions of race. In the middle here, and this is actually a screenshot that I took from the New York Times article. I'll show it again, but in the upper left-hand corner, you see these shirtless white guys chugging milk. And the reason why they're chugging milk was this idea that the ability to metabolize milk successfully is a white genetic trait. Also the symbolism of the milk, and also the performative kind of humor in the sense of this. And so basically what I wanted to discuss here with these three sort of exhibits are the way that these sort of memes are deployed broadly to draw people in, right? So race is a social construct, but you show the sort of African pygmies next to the European colonizer type, and so it shows that race is obviously real. You compare these different species pictures, but then you compare a person from Africa with Beethoven, and there's like, well, obviously these can't be the same species. And here's sort of one of the gender exhibits we write about in one of the papers, which is these really Baroque theories that try to use science in completely fallacious ways, but to explain political phenomena that they care about. So this is feminism is a disease that's caused by a certain retrovirus, and it gives the feminist phenotype, et cetera, et cetera. So it's this like very elaborate pseudoscientific kind of language. Okay, so I just want to a minute or two more. I just want to talk about, so science, I think, is a powerful kind of recruiting and dissemination strategy for a lot of these white nationalist ideas. And in an article in the New York Times, there on the left, I have this quote. The journalist talked to a young African-American teenager who was kind of in school, and he was going on Reddit to the our science forum, a bad science forum, and he's saying, please help me dispute the sort of pseudoscientific things that the white kids in my school are saying, because they talk very authoritatively. They know all this DNA talk. I don't know how to dispute this. It can't be right. But then he says, you know, it's convincing me things I don't want to be convinced of, right? So there's this discourse out there that like is not being challenged strongly enough. And so this is one of the places where this, you know, where young people are encouraged, what happened? There we go, are encouraged to come in and learn about the science, and this is just like one of many, many websites that kind of package science talk for people, and you see this little arrow here highlighting, this says, ready to take the red pill? So this discourse is explicitly connected to the alt-right. And it's connected to the idea that they have an access into knowledge and discourse that the institutions, like the UCLAs and the you know, PBSs of the world, don't want you to know about, right? This is a forbidden knowledge that we have and that we can introduce you into. And so I just want to end by sort of saying that science does several things for white nationalists. On the one hand, as Louay was describing, it's used to support and naturalize the ideology of white supremacy that Bethan described a minute ago. It's also used as a kind of recruitment tool, but leveraging rationalism, right? So this, for the people who are maybe not drawn in by the hate per se, you get drawn in through this other pathway, right? It also allows a kind of community, right? This sort of space of solidarity, right? This is the stuff you can't talk about in your sociology class at college, or you know, maybe in your high school class. And you know, scholars of white nationalism have often discussed the music shows, the gatherings, the rallies, the gangs that produce the kind of solidarity. But I think these online forums where you can discuss these sort of outre ideas are a huge place that give certain people comfort. I mentioned this before, it allows this sort of critique of the dominant mainstream cultural cultural institutions. And it aligns people with powerful discourse and actors. Of course, you know, Trump has in the last election, you know, talked about good genes, the racehorse theory of, you know, why the good people of Minnesota are so excellent and should vote for him, et cetera, et cetera. So he and others have drawn upon this. And I think it also gives opportunities for rethinking and reviving the far-right political program, right? So we could go into this later, maybe in the Q&A. Sorry, I've gone a little bit long, but like ways of rethinking and re-energizing white nationalism with new thought and new political ideas. So thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you so much, Aaron. So with that, we're gonna move on to Bethan's talk. And I think it's really interesting how we have kind of two strands emerging from these first two talks. We have the discussion of gender playing such a prominent role in Louay's talk, and then the discussion of race and DNA and pseudoscientific double helixes and things of that sort in Aaron's work. And what this ultimately gets to, if you think about it, aligns with ideas of reproduction. It aligns with the ideas of bloodlines. And very much kind of this science and this thing where on the one hand you have the kind of atavistic emotional appeal of the gender frustrations that often come through. But then you have the pseudoscientific appeal as well. They kind of marry in this worldview. And to get to some more on what that worldview is and kind of would likely look like in the future and the role of youth in facilitating this, we'll go to Bethan.
Hi, thanks everyone. So yes, I focus a lot of my research on children, and I really want to emphasize that topic around children. We say youth sometimes, or we say young people, but that often misunderstands, I think, a really important part, which is these people, even when they are engaging in violence, are themselves children in many instances. But the first thing I wanted to emphasize, not to disagree at all with the two other panelists, but to affirm and yet move forward, is to say a lot of the discussion that we see in popular coverage in journalism and other sources often ties Nazism, neo-Nazism, and the extreme right wing to social media, to sort of high-tech issues, TikTok, which becomes NazTalk, and online gaming and other things. And I think that that is helpful in understanding something that facilitates the spread of these ideas, but is not, in fact, doesn't encompass this, and it makes the villain technology in this story in many cases, when in fact I believe that what is the villain is the ideology. And in fact, what we're reaping is what we sow across time, and this is a cycle that continues. So I'm just going to move really quickly through these different time periods, but I wanted to look at individuals who were radicalized in their youth at different points, sort of from the 1940s in the United States onward. So we can really understand this issue and how many children, how many generations of children have been brought into this space. So you have, for instance, the 1940s and the 1950s, with the backdrop of everything from McCarthyism and the Red Scare to you have integration and the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement in many ways. You have, for instance, big figures such as Louis Beam, most particularly, who created leaderless resistance. So that's kind of what we now might call lone wolf terrorism. That was something that he was writing about. But again, he joined white supremacist movements in primary school. That was when he first encountered these things, though many others, his counterparts, including another Jewish person, actually was encountering neo-Nazism in high school and joining those movements. So in the 1960s, with the backdrop of the anti-Vietnam War and also the Civil Rights Movement, you have the likes of David Duke, who I think people commonly know, who was encountering white nationalists and white supremacy and that rhetoric in middle school and joined up very soon after that. You have James Mason, who I'm writing a book about presently. He actually first encounters the American Nazi Party at school with some of his friends. They accidentally showed a slide in his public sort of education class that had the phone number for the American Nazi Party in it, and they called that number, spoke to someone, and two of the boys in that class went on to be white supremacists, James Mason most particularly. He created Siege, which is behind a lot of terrorist white supremacist groups through to today. But again, you see a lot of this pattern around middle school and high school, so early teens. And the 70s and 80s, again, where you're still seeing a lot of social unrest. For ages 14, 15, there are some younger individuals who go as early as 11 or even sometimes in primary school. And I hope what I've emphasized with these bold is the different groups. They're not all being recruited by the exact same group. Lots of different white supremacist groups throughout these time periods were successfully infiltrating youth spaces and converting people. And the breadth that they spanned across time is massive. And so then you have into the 90s, again, we're looking at, interestingly enough, a phenomenon where most of the recruitment goes towards the teens, as opposed to slightly earlier, but you do see occasional primary school recruitment, or at least encounters with racist ideology in a positive fashion. Not to say that this is the first time they hear about racism, but that this is encounters wherein they're being recruited actively or those groups are being mentioned positively. And then sort of in the backdrop of a really concrete discussion around terrorism and what terrorism and hate look like, we have the more recent iterations. So you'll recognize some of these individuals. So for instance, Thomas Rousseau, who runs Patriot Front, was recruited in high school, and he views himself very much as an American patriot. He doesn't even identify really as a white supremacist in a traditional sense, but he, again, links concepts of whiteness and patriotism with the United States. But he was recruited in high school, as were several others, even school shooters. The Parkland school shooter was engaging with racial hate online and in other forums in his teens. And in the Unite the Right rally, the man who killed someone first engaged with neo-Nazism, we know, in middle school. And I found these engagements, there are many more, but these are self-professed, or at times also like the FBI will have FBI files, and if you FOIA them, they have found these are the connections. And so my contention in a lot of my research is to say that youth participation, youth recruitment is not incidental. It's not like the targets of white nationalist messaging is just everybody, and young people are kind of incidentally brought along, but in fact they have always been one of the main targets for these movements. So I have, for instance, Stormtrooper, which is the American Nazi Party, and the National Socialist Youth Movement. Those are from the 60s and the 70s, talking directly to children, trying to recruit them. And then the Daily Stormer, Andrew Anglin, he has specifically gone on and said that he is targeting children. Quote, "My site is mainly designed to target children 11 through teen years." So that is how they view their messaging. And so the question becomes, like, how are they doing this? Why has this been such a successful pitch across time, rather than something that has been sort of newly adapted to the social media age? And so part of it is like a long history of basically bringing these ideas straight into the spaces where children are. So that can be by creating community hangout spots. So you used to have like actual physical spaces where people could go and meet. You see one of them, the American Nazi Party headquarters. They actually, a lot of people don't understand how dangerous platforming white supremacists and neo-Nazis are in these speaking tours, but a lot of the white supremacists that I study would be invited by high school and college history professors to come in and talk to sort of shed light, the idea that like sunlight is the best disinfectant, when in fact that actually provides opportunities for young people who agree with them to physically meet someone who can then recruit them. So they're very dangerous. But then you do have, as time goes on, not just physical spaces to meet, though active clubs are more recent ones. So like a lot of gyms, people will go into a gym and recruit people. Boxing is particularly rife with this, but many other spaces. But they will go into online spaces, Roblox, they create and recreate physical space online. But that's not to say that this is like a new concept. They're dominating the virtual as well as the real world. And so they also, white supremacists, have long been willing to try their hand at anything high-tech, so like early message boards, forums, into going onto Spotify. They're using generative AI communities now, people to basically, they're willing to try and fail. They don't wait to see what's gonna, they don't have that kind of hesitancy to fail. And so this idea that we talk about like memes and meme culture as being new, and I'm sorry, these are offensive. I understand that that can be difficult for people to see, but I think it's also important if we're facing a problem to really look at it head on in order to fight it. But so this is dark humor and like memes, proto-memes almost. So you have a lot of like comic books and super horrific visuals for kids to latch onto. It also tells an almost Disney-like story, which like you have a clear hero and a clear villain. There's no nuance that needs to go on there, and so you're selling these like dark humor and also very simple stories. And that is what has converted across time to what we now know as like dark memes and meme culture. But this is something that actually these groups have been training themselves to develop for years and years and years. This isn't a learning curve that they're unfamiliar with. And I just want to really quickly, as I end here, just emphasize that for as much as we talk about young people being radicalized online or in their teens and other years, there are lots of white supremacists, white nationalists who grow up in these spaces. They are children who are raised by racist parents who then, from childhood, have gone on to engage in that kind of behavior. These are a few examples, most particularly William Luther Pierce, who wrote the Turner Diaries, was raised in a racist space and perpetuated that even through to his children. And this is the sort of face that we're seeing more recently. This one was taken less than a year ago, and other spaces where you're literally seeing children raised with a comfortability therein. So we need to be really careful when we're talking about youth radicalization. Sometimes the people that are radicalizing them are their parents, are their families, and so combating that takes on a different form. And that's something that I'm starting a new project on, so if you want to come talk to me about these kind of family fascists, it's a totally different world. But that's me.
Great, thank you so much. Well, really wonderful points here, and I think it's interesting you just kind of
I hate leaving like racist children on the
Oh,
board.
wait, you know what? We can put, I wish I had a nice desktop, but I don't. Okay, how about that? So, a couple of questions. So, first, I mean, one theme that ties together, and admittedly, this is not a spontaneous conversation, but we were planning this. One thing that came up was kind of looking at the role of this idea of having babies in various forms, be it from the fascist families we just saw at the end, to the gender entree that you talked about as a way to get people in. And one thing that we were thinking about is not just in terms of recruiting the youth, but also thinking in terms of potential recruitment coming from the other end, and that there's a lot of mainstream concerns right now about, or mainstream public differences, let's say, about questions of gender, reproduction, things of that sort. So I wonder if you all could comment a little bit on how this might tie in within some broader, more mainstream issues. And so maybe A, to what degree is there an overlap? And B, if there is an overlap, are there things we can do to avoid that being another entryway?
Sure. So I guess I can start with one concept you may or may not heard about. That is benevolent sexism. So through all the entire corpus that I analyzed, I've never seen any single post saying that we should kill all women. No, not even one. But they talk a lot about they favor a traditionalist lifestyle where women should stay at home, women should cook. So on the surface, what's wrong about that? If you really read between lines, that means they are supporting a world where women should be, the whole value of women is reproductive, and women should reproduce other white children for the white man. But they didn't say that explicitly. That's the subtext. But when they say that we should go back to the tradition, I think at least a portion of the how to say them, like peripheral followers think about the Seplan immediately, and that is why they really liked this gender topic, and they continue engaging with these people posting this kind of benevolent sexism rhetoric. So I'll pause here and see any other ideas we have.
So, I think that I didn't show too many images of the theme of gender, family, and the nation, though I did have that one. But this is a huge topic of discussion in this scientized right-wing spaces. This sort of idea of the great replacement theory that people have heard about is really drawing from one, a discourse of demographic transition and how that's happening in many different countries. It's drawing also on much longer rhetorics of zero population growth, the carrying capacity of various societies and so forth, which those sort of teeter between left and right, especially in the 60s and 70s when they were being announced, and then also a huge amount of discourse about, from a scientific point of view, can women be trusted? Are they? What is their function? Could we do without them? So it's not so much kill the women, but like, hey, could we just have, could we do without them? What technologies could replace women? And they often have an idea that, so one quote that we saw a lot in our research was that women are the Jews of gender. Now, what does that mean? So what they think that means is that women are potentially untrustworthy, that if they have had sexual relations with non-white people, then that might destroy their capacity to propagate the white race in the ways that they would like, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a lot of discourse about women being a problem in this scientized domain, and basically what to do about it and how to fix this problem. So a lot of the science discussion is about remaking the nation, and what is that nation, as I was sort of describing, and then how do we, all that, how do they get through problematic women to realize these visions?
All over, from all sides.
I apologize,
From all sides. No, so I think it's really important to mention for those who study white supremacist movements, the 14 words make reference to the future for white children. Implicit in that is the children have to be white, which again brings to Aaron's point questions around genetics. But there's also a secondary iteration of the 14 words that literally focuses on white women and protecting white women. So there is sort of caked into the fabric therein. But to sort of broader social questions that rope individuals in, I think when we have a lot of discussions around, for instance, sexual permissiveness in society and attention around like female sexual expression, and people commenting on that in the mainstream politics, like OnlyFans, is it okay, is it not okay? Sex work, is it okay, is it not okay? Like how many men should a woman have sex with before she is sort of undesirable? Or purity culture even, more generally speaking. Sex becomes the problem, and when sex becomes a problem and how women have sex becomes a problem, then who they have sex with, how often they have sex, and who's policing that comes into question, and issues of hierarchy are returned again. And interestingly enough, also when you're talking about reproductive health, it's also questions around like, oh, well, should we make abortion accessible for different populations based on their race? Because, for instance, like the perception, I don't agree with this, is that like non-white communities have too many children, and thus making abortion entirely restricted would be bad for white people because X, Y, and Z, or we should allow abortion for certain racial populations and not others. These are like questions that get roped in, but a lot of it again is around policing the female body, which also empowers particularly like young males that I study who want to have power and who want to think of themselves as superior to at least someone, and they may not have access, for instance, in their wealth, in their age, in their intellect, but they can find even at that young age within the male hierarchy space, the supremacy therein.
Thank you. Well, this has been great. I'm so sorry we're running short on time. We have time for just one more question I'm going to ask, and then I think we need to take a break, but everyone can talk to our panelists later, and we'll have some Q&A later. So I'm going to finish with a real softball. What do we do about this? Particularly talking about how it's male youth were really explicitly targeted with something that male youth think about a lot, which is sex and gender and things of that sort. What's the antidote, potentially? What should I do as the father of a 12-year-old to keep this from happening? Just maybe a couple of thoughts, and then we'll take a break.
I'll try to be quick. I would say decouple ideology and identity. So ideology is not identity. Even if someone believes in some ideas, like they are anti-abortion, that's not their identity. And that's the base for further communication and dialogue.
So I think one of the things is for people experts in expert spaces to spend more time debunking some of these ideas, and debunking them not in highly scholarly, scholastic, nerdy kind of discourse, but in memes, in finding ways to attack some of these ideas, fighting fire with fire, at least in terms of the formal ways that these ideas are often expressed. I think that would be one helpful step.
Yeah, I think one helpful step of many has to be the idea that a lot of the white supremacist groups that I look at are really good at sort of doing, they look at the world from the level of the teenager who approaches them or the young person. They get down to their level. And so, for instance, if a young person finds themselves being bullied, they may say, I'm being bullied by a person of a different race. And instead of saying, no, that's not an issue. We need to meet people where they are and say, I'm sorry that's happening to you. Don't tokenize one person who's bullying you to be representative of anyone, but to not dismiss the problems that teenagers are having, just helping them see that those are individuated rather than part of a collective, like I said, sort of larger movement, because what white supremacists have been really effective at doing is say like, oh, you were picked on by this non-white person in your school, and this is part of a structure, and nobody's taking you seriously because it's all a conspiracy therein. And when young people say things maybe wrong initially, or they do over-aggrandize a problem, instead of being like, that's super horrible of you to say, how could you assume that? Help them understand that like people are individuals, and individuals are responsible for their actions and not collectively.
Awesome, thank you. So we didn't quite get at the exit, but we did get at some of the avoiding the entrance at least, which I think is key, given that this is a long-term thing. Well, with that, thank you so much for our wonderful panel, and I think we're all going to take a quick break and stretch our legs. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Mario Mendez. My colleagues and I have been studying hate. Our project, The Relationship of Hate to Dehumanization, has extended to looking at other neurocognitive mechanisms. We have a successful model for eliciting hate using actors in vignettes. And in that paradigm, we've been able to successfully elicit hate and go on to study them with various tools looking at dehumanization, theory of mind or mentalization, empathy, and morality. Now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Alexander Shepard, for the results.
So the findings from our pilot show that the methods we used previously still effectively induce hate, and that those with a less effective theory of mind or mentalization are more prone to being hateful. Utilitarian morality appears associated to hate. That is to say that those who are hated are more likely to be victims of utilitarian thinking. And lastly, by morally humanizing someone, a hated individual is hated less and is dehumanized less. We want to thank Ish for supporting our work, and we look forward to sharing more of our findings soon.
We're excited to be here today to talk about the broad media landscape and hate. We have three esteemed researchers here, and I'll allow them to introduce themselves, and Dr. Cruz is joining us on Zoom.
Hi, I'm Sadia. I'm an assistant professor in computer science. Oh, there we go. And I'm also with the Bunch Center for African American Studies. My relationship with Ish is that Hello. Okay, I think this is good. So I've been working on the involvement of AI in content moderation and hate speech for some time, particularly looking into what are equity issues with the deployment of AI-based content moderation tools and issues with their robustness that affect users in deployments. So I got involved with Ish because we were working on projects around how do we actually bring in perspectives from communities who are targeted by hate speech and toxic content into the actual development process. And we have a project where we've been working on a participatory framework for annotation of the training data used for these tools and creating content moderation tools that are able to capture varying values and norms across these communities and ensure that we have equitable decisions in terms of content moderation across those communities.
Okay, so I'm Tim Groling. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication. I was laughing earlier when David was saying it's hard to track the number of different projects they funded, and I'm part of that problem, I think, because I have a finger in a bunch of different pots here, in part because my department for the last 50 years has built this massive television news archive that is being used on a bunch of different projects to study mass media presentations of hate over time. So when Howard was talking about the homelessness project, he was able to use our recordings to track how television news presented that over time. And so that, and then Russia Disinformation Project was also using our data. I had a team of undergraduates working tirelessly for the last few years studying how LA local news presents. It wasn't hate directly, but we were interested in maybe precursors of that, which is how information about crime and race were presented to the public, especially victim narratives, and how that information is conveyed. And I guess I'll get into the details of that a little bit more later on, but undergraduates were basically really grooving 1989 LA local news and comparing it to what they saw in 2019 across a random sample, and also getting to know the newscasters and Chris Terror and all that fun stuff from the 80s. So it was really illuminating for them. And then also separately, one of my main areas of research is credibility of information, how persuasion works, how people might be persuaded to change deeply held views. So part of that is dealing with misinformation and whether or not you can change people's minds if they believe things that aren't true, and what things might make that more successful, less successful. So that line of experimental research I've largely been doing with my PhD student, Jae-Hoon Che, who's actually the PI on our most recent round of these grants. And so basically, that's more of controlled experiments, and then the original set is more observational, so I'm trying to mix those two into a broader project. So I'll stop there.
Thank you for letting me be a part of this. As I always like to say, I'm the director of ISH Michigan's branch, and I've been working with ISH for a couple of years now. And mostly we work on misinformation and hate, and looking at developing and testing new interventions to address misinformation and to promote good uses of information in politics, mostly in countries like the Philippines, but extending to different regions around the world as well.
Great. So this panel is about hate in the broad media landscape, and so we are going to be talking first. I can also stop. You want me to shout?
No, I will figure out the thing in a second.
Okay. So we're going to start by talking about what is hate, what does it look like in the broad media landscape, which includes print media, television news, social media, and then we're going to talk about how it impacts people. And then we're going to talk about interventions. So what can we actually do to mitigate the hate that we're seeing in media today? So I wanted to start off with a question about different patterns, changing patterns that we're seeing over time of hate in the media. And I thought that Tim could speak to his work first, your research project, because you are specifically looking at patterns in media and how hate has changed over time.
So yeah, and thank you. So we're doing a little less directly again, not hate specifically, but looking at differential patterns of coverage of race and violence that I think are related to that. One, and again, those who attended the presentation last year, I gave a capsule version of this then, but just to summarize, my students were kind of surprised how racist 1989 news was, and how much of an improvement there had been to 2019. So I mean, if people are looking for positive changes over time, that's definitely an area where there's less overt and less, I would say, code wording of racism. So the fixation on gangs, in particular in 1989, is extremely racially coded, and my students are very sensitive to that. The way in which victimization was covered in 1989, white victims were given disproportionate coverage for equivalent crimes, comparing the statistics of the actual incidence of the crime versus what was shown in the news media. It was relatively unusual. Like, it was basically priced in that crime in certain neighborhoods, and they would say this explicitly, sometimes was not surprising, and thus would get less coverage. And it was very different in 2019, comparatively speaking. One of the things that was very interesting in terms of maybe a potential agent of change, which is jumping to the third question a little bit, was the coverage we saw in 2019 was much more even-handed on the basis of the race of the victim than it was in 1989. But part of that also, when we dug deeply, and again, my students read these stories in some detail, was in part because community action, was in part because of community reaction that was being covered that seemed to stimulate more news coverage. So we looked at that in terms of whether or not the stories also mentioned that somebody was angry or sad about that death. And that seemed to correlate very highly with the jump in the coverage of non-white victims that were covered with explicit mentions of their race. We found less strong or significant results on the sort of perpetrator side. Other people have studied that and sort of found patterns that seem to ebb and flow. But at least on the victim side, it is something where there is, at least as of 2019, much more even-handed, much more balanced, much more connected to the underlying data, although still a bias towards white victims getting disproportionate coverage compared to the actual number of violent crimes with white victims. So that's a quick summary. Sure.
And we'll return to the theme of kind of community action when we talk about interventions. But Sadia, first, AI is kind of a blip in the arc of human history. It's so new. But I'd love to hear a little bit about how you see AI as changing these patterns of hate that are displayed online.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as you just said, when looking back into the past, when we're thinking about the way that media might perpetuate or instigate hate, it was all looking at human language. Now we're in this era where we have these very powerful computational models, these large language models like ChatGPT, that are able to generate content that isn't necessarily discernible from human language at a scale that humans aren't capable of. And there's a lot of potential risks that come along with that, as well as some negative outcomes that we're already observing and trying to come up with interventions against, where we can see cases of people trying to misuse these large language models specifically for either creating hateful examples or creating content that might then create an environment that's more conducive to hateful and violent behaviors. That going way back, only 4 years ago, there was a well-cited paper from, I think it was the Middlebury Counterterrorism Center, that was talking about the kind of risk that might emerge with these large language models in terms of perpetuating far-right extremism. More recently, there was a report showing that internet manipulators were already using platforms like OpenAI's platform for influence operations. So this is a very real problem that we're now dealing with, where we have these cases of these large language models being used to further specific agendas. And that connects a lot of the work going on in my research group, where we're focusing on hate, but we're also focusing on misinformation and the relationship between the two, and looking at the capabilities of large language models for persuasion, and how do we think about evaluations that can take into account not just the positive aspects of persuasion with large language models and the ways in which we can use them themselves as interventions to try to counter this vast influx of harmful language being spread in digital spaces, but also how can we evaluate their capabilities for negative persuasion and actually perpetuating harmful behaviors, and develop new safety methods that might make them harder to misuse in that way. So that's one aspect of how AI is reshaping the landscape in terms of hate speech. Another aspect that I want to get into that relates to our ISH project is actually the intervention side. So we've seen over the past few years, there's been a lot of interest in adaptation of these technologies, generative AI technologies like ChatGPT, to try to actually scale up content moderation efforts, with the motivation that large language models don't get tired, large language models are not going to have mental health effects from going into these digital spaces and interacting with hate speech. And so it seems like these could be useful tools in combating the harmful behaviors that we're seeing online. But then in my prior research and research from others, what we've been seeing is that they're not infallible. There's a lot of works that still needs to be done here. And some of the errors actually made by these models when they're used as intervention tools could actually perpetuate harms that they're being deployed to stop. So there was some work that we did a few years ago that was picked up by a lot of news media, including Fortune, among others, and Forbes, that was showing that there were higher cases of them falsely flagging African-American English speakers as using hate speech, which could lead to this ironic situation where the very tools that are being deployed as interventions to protect these communities are actually then leading to this cultural erasure and harming those users. And so that's motivated a lot of the work that I'm now doing on trying, how do we actually develop technologies where we're bringing in people who are going to be affected by their decisions into the process of developing these technologies to try to preemptively prevent some of these errors that might arise and inequities that might arise from the deployment of these tools.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. It's a strange world where we have AI-generated content being checked by humans and human-generated content checked by AI, and kind of switching roles a lot. Can you just briefly define content moderation in case people don't know, because we'll be coming back to it.
Right. So when I'm talking about content moderation, I'm broadly talking about tools, strategies, rule systems that are used in determining what content should be visible on these digital platforms like Twitter and Facebook, and what content should actually be either removed from that platform or flagged in some way. So there's various different approaches to this. There's full censorship kind of approach where you would think about removing any kind of content that's been determined as harmful. And then there's less strict approaches like what the former Twitter, now X, is using, community notes, where they have users flag certain content as potentially being harmful and provide some explanation for why it might be harmful. So there's different approaches to this, but broadly it's talking about governance of these online spaces and how do we determine whether content is harmful or safe.
Thank you. I don't know if Ceci can hear us, but could she share a little bit? Okay, great. Hi. Could you share a little bit about how hate is showing up in your research in the Philippines during election times?
Hi everyone. Yes, thank you. I can. It was nice to be able to hear everybody else. I think for me, the trends that we're seeing with hate, I think, are coinciding with two political trends and changes in politics that are happening at the same time, that are making it almost more difficult to deal with, right? Or sort of exacerbating the effects of hate when we're thinking about political landscapes and especially around election time. And one of those things I think in terms of these sort of dangerous trends is the rise of a more populist type of politics, right? So in one hand, there's sort of nothing inherently wrong with the idea of populism if you think about it in terms of bringing politics to the people. But in practice, what ends up is because these kind of movements arise from this sort of fundamental disenchantment with politics in the sense that people's voices haven't been heard, a lot of the way that politicians use to consolidate their power and support in these types of settings is to sort of create this very contentious or very polarized brand of politics. And that's where I think a lot of the new ways that we're seeing hate play out in political messaging has come in. Because a big part of the populist playbook is sort of casting us versus them type of rhetoric. And so that's usually what we're seeing in terms of sort of hate speech or discourse, the hateful discourse on in like political settings in a way that we hadn't really seen that before. I think this is sort of a new type of political communication in that sense. The other trend that I think stands out in my mind when we're thinking about hate and the sort of broader issues around it is the fact that the nature of political communications are changing, right? The people are now getting their political information, not just from the news or from their neighbors, but from social media, TikTok, a whole variety of different things that happen to also play well with the type of populist playbooks and emotional campaign messaging in a way that, before you could imagine that we would have debates and policies and that sort of thing. But nowadays with TikTok, it's really difficult, right? In a 20-second TikTok to articulate your economic position. And by contrast, much, much easier if you're running a campaign that's based on sort of setting up an us versus them type of dynamic, to have a message that's really leaning on this sort of hate or this sort of very relational type of polarization that's happening in the country by scaring people about immigrants, for example. That's sort of a very common populist politician strategy to sort of create that connection with the voters by casting an outgroup of some sort as the enemy. And so to me, those are the two big trends, I think, that are making hate even more difficult to address when it comes to political communication and political information. And the fact that because of social media being a big source of political information and political discourse, it's also this sort of it's sort of a doubly bad effect in the sense that just participating, engaging in these communities can sort of reinforce social identities, right? So it sort of makes people even more entrenched, right? So they're not just getting hateful messaging through these sources, but by replying, connecting, right, sharing the information, they're sort of reinforcing it as part of a social identity that makes it much harder for us to address with just purely, corrective type of information, right? So we're also seeing a lot of the trends and interventions is that we're seeing interventions having a backlash effect, right? Because once you get to that point where part of my social identity is being somebody that is really, that's against immigrants, or being somebody that is very particular about who I think an American is or who I think a citizen of the country is, then even when we try to do these corrective interventions that might have worked, even just a couple of years ago, because it's no longer just about information, but it's about this broader idea of community and social identity, we're finding in a lot of cases that these purely correction or fact-checking type of interventions simply haven't been working.
That's fascinating and disheartening. Ceci, I'd like to stay with you for a minute to talk a little bit more about how people are countering hate that they're seeing online. In your research, can you give us some examples of how people are countering hate during elections in particular?
That's great, and thank you for your patience with making this work so I can participate. I think there's sort of two kind of answers to that, right? One in the sense of what we're finding in places like the Philippines and even the US, where because of partly AI and what Sadia was talking about is that the evolution of different ways to produce hateful content, the coding, like hiding hateful content under things that look, pretty innocuous to bypass filters. So there's sort of that has far outpaced our ability to come up with technological solutions for finding and identifying the hate. So what you mentioned about how, having ordinary people, like being the sort of frontline defense has been exactly the type of interventions that we've been focusing on in the Philippines, right? Precisely because there's not that kind of infrastructure to be able to create filters, do content moderation, all those types of things that you could imagine sometimes we have in places like the US. And so what the focus of our intervention has been thinking about countering hate as beyond a story about misinformation, right? So what we're trying to address is like a twofold type of thing. One is making communities as a whole more resilient, right? And the communities are an important piece of this because if we think about, this vulnerability to misinformation and hate as not just, something about whether I know the information or not, but whether I feel like as part of this community, I'm supposed to believe this, then it becomes really important to target our interventions to communities, right? To people's network, right? If you're, and that also lets us leverage social norms in a nicer way, right? To kind of get people thinking about, in this community, we help each other find the right answers, or in this community, it's important for us to tell the truth. And so that becomes the focus of that sort of, on one hand, resilience building interventions that we've been doing in the Philippines. And that has had a great effect on getting people to sort of confront, I guess, or dialogue with other people in their community. So, as they see something being shared that's hateful, they can then say, oh, you know what, I've seen, and in a way that's much more natural, right, than if it were some content like external NGO or content moderation. So these are just sort of neighbors supporting each other and helping each other find the right information. So we've seen a lot of positive effects with that. We've also seen as another effect of our community-based trainings was essentially changing people's information diets, right? So instead, they still use TikTok, don't get me wrong, people are still using TikTok, but if you ask them where they get their political information or where they get their news, the share that comes from TikTok becomes smaller. Right, so they're still using Facebook and TikTok just as much as before, dog pictures, watching funny videos, etc. Just that they're relying on those sources less for politics, right? And so to us, that was the easiest behavioral change to make. It's very difficult to teach people how to identify misinformation because, like Sadia was saying, the AI is so good now that even for me, my aunties will send me something and I'll have to look it up. Right? It'll be like Trump said, Trump is giving money to Duterte for his defense at the ICC. I'm like, especially nowadays, like you hear something crazy on the news, it might be true, right? We have politicians in the US that are so unpredictable that it's hard to be able to guess whether something is true or not. So my thinking is, if I'm somebody that studies this topic and I still have to look up, these things to know if it's misinformation or not, how are we going to train people to do this? And so the focus of our interventions has been on the sort of broader community resilience, right? And together with that, an ability to use sources and source cues to help people identify like what's a good source and what isn't. Even if it's very, very difficult to get them to the point where they can learn to distinguish what's misinformation and not. And in fact, actually, I think one weird effect of getting people to stop using TikTok and Facebook for their political news is that if they're presented with an entirely new set of misinformation, they won't have the exposure, right? So they won't even know about it in advance, and so it's harder for them to be able to tell the difference. However, if you pair that with a source cue, like you say, this misinformation or this piece of information came from the New York Times, right? Or you came from BBC. Then what we find is that the people who receive these trainings do a much better job than people who didn't, right? So it's sort of a good and bad, right? Like we're not quite to the point where the interventions can get people to identify it well enough, but we can sort of foster more community level resilience, and we can foster these sort of healthy information diets, if that makes sense. And teach people how to use those other clues that they have that are about the information to sort of help them make those choices and evaluate the information in much more sophisticated ways.
Thank you, Ceci. And that's so true. If we, as researchers, cannot understand whether what we're seeing is truthful or false, that's a bigger problem that needs to be managed. So, to that end, I wanted to talk more about interventions. And I was just talking to someone about how it feels like in this time, the question on all of our lips is, what can we do? A lot of us feel so powerless with everything happening right now. So, Tim, maybe you could give us some insights into the trends that you're seeing and how we as audience members can better understand what we're seeing in the media now, in the local news. What are kind of the hallmarks of hateful speech or language, or like what are you seeing in your research that helps us understand what we're seeing as hate, even if it's not coded that way?
Thanks. And I'm actually going to jump off a little bit what Ceci was saying as well, because she, I think, was doing a very good job talking about one of the problems that Jae Hoon and I are trying to deal with as well, which is the fact-checking, the sort of misinformation correction that people had a lot of high hopes for has obviously not stemmed the tidal wave of misinformation in the real world. So part of what we've been trying to do rigorously is understand, what is this disconnect between the laboratory, where people are still finding great results that are kind of surprising, like you'll find people exposed to counter-attitudinal political information, that it's anti-Republican fact check, and they're like, okay, I'm Republican, I believe that in the lab, but we don't see that as much in the real world. So part of what we've been trying to do is understand, where this falls down. So one thing that Jae Hoon has just finished doing a relatively large-scale examination of X/Twitter data of how are they exposed to fact checks? Like when you see them referenced online, who is sending them? Most people are not going to those sites. They have very little traffic. So it's mostly people sharing them. And what you find is motivated reasoning. You find Democrats sharing fact checks of Republicans that say Republicans are false, not actually sharing information where Democrats are rated false. You see Republicans undermining the credibility, citing the fact checks to dispute them and to basically say they're wrong, or in other cases to make fun of them or share parody ones that are making fun of the entire enterprise of fact checking. So when you're exposed to these things on social media by somebody who has sent it to you, they have had a motivation that is not your more correct information. They're doing it for politically motivated reasons. So that's one flaw with the current system of how people are exposed to fact checks, is they're not often exposed to them by somebody who's trying to enlighten them versus to motivate them politically. When we look also at fact-checked exposure in the traditional lab model and you expose people to a fact check, we're able to demonstrate that if you just show them the fact check, they're pretty persuaded. If you show someone either attacking the credibility of the fact check organization or disputing the fact check, the effects go away. So that is also very common for people to be sharing a fact check to dispute it and in effect inoculating people against that information in the future and nulling out the result. So that was, I think, a relatively strong result. The other thing that we did in again, Jae Hoon set up methodologically a very rigorous and clever experiment that tested not just the effect of how long these fact checks last in people's minds. The answer is 4 days before the effects go away. So you're fighting the ocean that is washing away your sandcastle. It will not last more than 4 days probably if you fact check somebody, unless it's sustained. So comparing that versus one where you don't necessarily make people go through the entire process, but just ask them an accuracy reminder of, is this information accurate? Not even telling them it's wrong, but just asking them. That actually sustains the effect for a long time. So just making people prioritize thinking of accuracy when they're evaluating political information, just keeping that top of mind actually can sustain the effect for a long time. And then we're also experimenting, but haven't deployed in the field yet. Still hopeful ideas that misinformation correction, even on highly polarized issues, can bring people, if you sustain it in these sort of ways, lasting change in their attitudes. So that was a quick, and mostly about the new stuff. I can also talk about the local news changes briefly. So again, I think it really does make a difference to not have the news organizations be encoders and perpetuators of this stuff, which is really, as I mentioned, gone away. When we did our initial set of results, I was surprised because we didn't see a big effect. When my students were coding stories that had what they thought was racial or other types of discrimination in the story, but then we subdivided it by whether or not it was coverage of a crime or coverage that basically the news organization was injecting this bias themselves. And the big difference between our 2 years is there's much more coverage of these sort of hate crimes now than there was in 1989. And there's much less of the news organization basically saying casually racist things or otherwise injecting it themselves. So I think there's a heightened, in the more recent year, a heightened awareness of these things happening in the community and less perpetuation of it by the news organizations.
Sadia, could you share a little bit about the interventions that you're most excited about, that you're working on? Perhaps you could talk about your community-engaged intervention research.
Yeah, so I can start by talking about that project. A lot of the work that we've been doing around interventions is more reactionary, thinking about when content is already being spread on these platforms. How do we come up with tools to deal with this? So for that particular direction, then my PhD student Ashima has been working on the participatory framework that I mentioned, where we've been looking at 8 different communities of people who have been historically targeted by hate speech, and how do existing tools function when we re-annotate hate speech benchmarks to reflect perspectives from those communities, and finding that a lot of the existing tools are actually not aligned with the perspectives of people in the targeted communities, with varying results. So my student's been doing pretty comprehensive analysis across these different groups, looking at what are the differences when you consider the perspectives of people within the communities versus the perspectives of annotators outside of those communities, and seeing that there are a number of cases for which people outside the communities may see harm where there is no harm. That's the case of where we could see this kind of a cultural erasure problem that I mentioned earlier, where there could be examples of reclaimed language that's used within communities, and that's considered legitimate and not harmful within that community, but is viewed differently outside of that community. And then also cases where people outside of that community were missing harmful examples because they didn't have the lived experiences to actually identify that this is maybe a subtler, more coded example of hate speech or toxic language. And so we've also been developing new tools based on this data that we collected that are able to make decisions that are more in line with perspectives from those communities, as well as public policies from platforms of how they deal with content moderation. So we were showing that these tools are more in line with Facebook's content moderation policies, for example, and that work is coming out publicly later this week. It's called Model Citizens. In terms of how do we actually shift behavior before it reaches to this critical point of actually turning into toxic language or hate speech, this more proactive kind of approach we could take to interventions. That's work that we've been doing as well on the misinformation side. So there's some work that my student Solomon has been leading that it'll also be out soon, where we're looking at how AI can actually help in raising the online literacy of social media users and alerting them to potentially incredible content, and shifting their beliefs in cases where we have this confirmation bias phenomena that Tim was talking about, where people are more likely to share content or believe content that reinforces the cognitive biases that they have, or if they have a certain political bias that reinforces that. And so in that work, we're looking at when you have 2 different language models that are arguing for opposing sides of opinion on the claim. And you have users analyze this interaction, this debate that's going on between these language models that actually helps them in better discerning the reliability of the claim, where we're seeing major improvement in the user's ability to discern reliability when they have mainstream beliefs, but we're also seeing a small effect where it's helping them, assisting them in identifying reliability of claims, even if they have strong prior beliefs.
Thank you. So just to wrap up, I think we've talked about interventions at a few different levels. We've talked about individual level interventions where you're kind of educating individuals, or content moderation, flagging things on Twitter about things that are false according to the New York Times or what have you. We have kind of community norm setting, community resilience interventions. There seem to be more structural level interventions. To my knowledge, no one from like Meta is here in the audience, but I do know that we have some people involved in government. So I thought we could finish up the panel with some recommendations that you think that policymakers and governments could take into account. What do you think that governments can do, local, state level, federal, well, maybe not federal at this point, but whatever level government you want to speak to, what you think they can do specifically about hate in the broad media landscape that you're studying. And I'll start with Sassy.
I think for me, if I had a wish list for government and policymakers, is to think about misinformation not really as it sounds silly because as the word information is in the name of the problem, but to think of it not as an information deficit, but as a social problem, a social phenomenon, right? And that we need to think about interventions that can leverage the types of community environments and sort of information networks that people are a part of. And especially when we're looking outside the US, when we're thinking about how to produce interventions that are not just scalable, but also culturally embedded, right? That are more appropriate to the different contexts that it exists in. Those are really key issues for avoiding backlash. And avoiding the possibility that we're essentially, you can imagine making people more well-informed, but then maybe you're pulling apart, you're increasing polarization, or you have these other types of difficult effects. So to me, the biggest ask is to think about misinformation not as a sort of very individual type of problem, but as a problem with the information environment as a whole, the political information environment as a whole. I also think from a policy perspective, it's much easier to teach people how to identify good sources or to support good sources and access to good sources rather than trying to do a lot of content moderation or trying to pass laws that are, just because with technology, it's so hard to get ahead of it, right? And it almost seems a bit like there's if government can do something or policymakers can do something, it'll be in creating an infrastructure that makes it easier for people to find their own information, right? Or to find their own good sources of information rather than trying to stop all of the bad information from getting out, right? So they can still do that too. I'm not saying we give up and we just let everybody post their hate speech online, but trying to get that down to 100% is, I think, a really difficult battle to have. And it's better to instead think about how do we make our communities more resilient to this type of speech and these types of effects. The last is, I think, thinking about how to foster this broader, healthier political information environment, right? So producing, like in the Philippines, for example, one thing that we find works really well is just making politicians commit to what their policy positions are and then giving that information to voters. So those are things where the government can do that. The Elections Commission was thinking about scaling that up. There's all these sort of efforts and ways to think about how they can be a source of good information and how they can support that broader infrastructure and environment. Especially we're seeing a lot of, the threats against the media in places like the US, right? So we can't, it looks like maybe it doesn't have a whole lot to do with misinformation and hate, but it really does, right? Because the minute we're cutting back on the healthy parts of our information environment, it makes being able to police the hate speech and other like really harmful content much more difficult. Because I think it needs to be a two-pronged approach, right? You have to also foster that resilience for individuals and communities, in addition to the types of policies that or rules that you want to put on what kind of information can be produced and shared. So for me, it's like, can we think about this a little bit broader? That'd be like number one thing on my policy wish list for sure.
I think that was extremely well said. If there's anything that I would add on to that, I would bring up a recent case that happened where there was an interaction between AI chatbot and a child that the outcome of this was the child ended up committing suicide, and there's now an ongoing legal case between the developers of that chatbot and the family, where the developers tried to use the argument that chatbots have free speech, which was recently thrown out in that legal case. But I think this really is one example that highlights how dangerous these emerging technologies that we don't understand very well could potentially be and have already possibly been, and that we do need a more concrete regulatory framework around these technologies, the same as we do for a lot of other products, same as we do for cars, for transportation, for example, where if people's lives are at stake, then we need to have some safety measures in place to ensure to mitigate the risks of misuse that we're now seeing. So I am not sure how conducive the current political environment is to this, but I know prior to recent times there were some efforts being put in place to try to come up with a blueprint for AI safety that was still very open-ended, is kind of nebulous. And so in the future, I would really like to see more concrete policy around that. Maybe following up from what we've seen in other areas, like with the FDA and with healthcare. There's more regulation around AI in healthcare.
So I'd like to agree 100% that our current political communication environment and our current state of AI are both terrifying. Like, I don't say that word lightly. We're in a terrifying environment where the ability to counteract false information from our existing institutions has been weakened because those institutions are much weaker. The trust in news media, the trust in the sort of public professional group that we entrusted for decades to help us solve this problem has dropped to catastrophically low levels. So if you're looking at an AI-generated clip that somebody's spreading on TikTok versus what the evening news is saying, that's a fair fight, and it shouldn't be right now. People are going to treat the AI-generated content potentially with the same amount of base credibility in that. So I think that we need to think very seriously about how we're going to protect and establish greater public faith in a canonical version of the truth. So we're an institution that should be doing this. Like, universities are the stockpile of knowledge for society. That's why we're here. That's why they pay us to be here, is to do this task for the society. And we're doing a lot of those things, like our libraries. If you want to know if something is true or not, making it so we are vouching for this. It is in our library. This is the actual version of it, that people can say, this is a chain of custody, so I can trust this, versus random things that are distributed peer-to-peer as almost gossip online. I think that we need to take that role more seriously and foster ways for people to have an easy entree into a higher version of information than they get on social media. So that's one dimension. On the news side, you can't make people watch the news. But you can potentially, if you're a news organization, work on ways to increase public trust through transparency, through being much more open in your processes, through making things much more accessible to the public that allow them to see not just the final product, but the sort of stages along that process. So I think that there are a lot of things that we could do to foster, it doesn't have to be every news organization, but I think there need to be some news organizations that put an even higher premium now on professionalism, on transparency, and on establishing basically a paper trail or some sort of chain of custody of the information they put out there, so that people know they can go to that organization and get the information they need to trust it. And when they weigh in, it is not going to be partisan. It is not going to be biased. And I think that's pre-positioning a resource that we're all going to need, because the sort of ability to generate AI video, like you've seen with Google tool, it's terrifyingly good. It is terrifyingly good, and it is just going to get better. And I say better, I mean worse, in terms of being able to distinguish it from reality. So we need to think about how to pre-position information that people can trust and make it accessible to fight against it now, because that battle can be lost in months compared to where we are now. It is terrifying.
Thank you, everyone, for bearing with us during the technical difficulties. It sounds like we'll take a short break and resume in a few minutes. Thanks.
Hi everyone, my name is Salma Musa. I'm an assistant professor of political science here at UCLA. I am very sorry that I can't be with you, but what better reason than to be getting on a flight to present the results from this ISH-funded research. So my project tries to answer the question, can exposure to celebrities from minority groups, specifically ethnic minorities, foreigners, and Muslims, reduce prejudice in the same ways as traditional face-to-face intergroup contact typically does? So in the first part of the study, we scraped millions of tweets and Reddit posts and newspaper articles, and surprisingly found almost no difference at all in how fans or journalists talk about minority players compared to majority group players in general, and even after they have a bad day. So we actually matched all that social media and newspaper data with fantasy data to see how well players were performing, and we don't see a relationship between player identity and how people talk about that player in general or conditioning on a bad performance. With ISH's support, we're now moving on to a survey experiment where we're hoping to collect thousands of surveys to measure whether negative articles about minorities, such as Muslims and ethnic minorities, can nonetheless have an outsized effect on intergroup attitudes and feelings of social belonging, specifically among members of those minority groups. So stay tuned for the results, and I can't wait to share them with you soon.
Hi, my name is Catherine Heather, and I'm a postdoctoral research associate in anti-Semitism studies at UCLA's Initiative to Study Hate and the Levy Center for Jewish Studies, where I examine the sonic mediation of hate on social media. My project, Sonic Anti-Semitism, Auditory Mechanisms of Hate, explores how music voiceovers and viral audio trends are used on platforms such as TikTok, Instagram, and X to circulate anti-Semitic and hateful content. Sometimes it's blatant, like the chorus of Kanye West's recent single, Heil Hitler, which was designed for virality and has underscored millions of videos in its original, remixed, and stitched forms. But more often, it's harder to detect. Hate is embedded in jokes, nostalgic tracks, or how certain sounds are paired with visuals. In other words, it's coded, and it's contextual. For me, this work is personal. Sound shapes how we feel, how we remember, and how we perceive others. And honestly, I think everyone listening to this right now would agree with me. For instance, if I suddenly started talking like this, you might not take me as seriously. But when I speak with a calm pacing and authority, your perception shifts. Hate hides in sonic spaces. It slips in through crude assumptions, a song, a joke, or a trend. And when it becomes a vibe on the internet, it becomes much easier to overlook in everyday life. My intelligence didn't change because my voice did, but cultural understandings of that sonic reception would say otherwise. I study this to help us stop missing those cues, to hear them, name them, and question them, before silence becomes complicity. Thank you for listening.
the Social Media and Spread of Hate, or SMASH study. My name is Christine Ong. I'm a researcher at the Crest Center, and this is our team. SMASH has been funded by UCLA's Initiative to Study Hate starting in 2022. We're a collaboration between UCLA's School of Education and Information Studies and our nonprofit partner, Organization for Social Media Safety. We also are partnering with UCLA's Semel Healthy Campus Initiative. Our goal is to lay a foundation for future studies examining how hate speech in particular on social media may affect youth mental health and learning trajectories. We are doing that by understanding how youth perceive or what they perceive to be hate speech, documenting its prevalence, and building an infrastructure to monitor trends over time and ways to counter hate speech. We use a mixed methods approach, including analysis of survey data gathered from OFSMS assemblies. We have over 29,000 respondents, anonymous respondents from grades 5 through 12 across 10 states. We've also piloted an undergraduate survey with similar questions and are gathering qualitative data via focus groups and teen advisory meetings, as well as interviews. And now for key findings. Focusing on our data from grades 5 through 12, we find nearly 20% of students reported using social media for 9 hours or more on an average day. This is student report. Almost half have been cyberbullied, and 8 in 10, roughly, have encountered hate speech on social media in the last month. In fact, a majority of respondents have seen hate speech related to race, ethnicity, gender, and religious beliefs in the last month. There are also patterns in the data. We find that exposure to cyberbullying and hate speech increase with daily time spent on social media. Our impact. Our findings clearly indicate high use of social media is related to exposure to hateful content, and our results have been shared at various levels and for different communities, as well as informing OFSM. Thank you. Please contact us for more information.
Hi, I'm Dr. Bethan Johnson, and I'm a postdoc for the last 2 years with UCLA's Initiative to Study Hate, being supervised particularly by David Myers. So the project that I've been working on while I've been here has really been an umbrella project looking at the enterprise of extremism. So I use that term to talk about how propaganda is sold or pitched to potential consumers, recruits, the various mechanisms and sort of activities of those who are already radicalized, and then also how we can sell an alternative narrative to people to help them exit the extremist movement. But I'm particularly interested in the elements related to recruitment, specifically youth recruitment. So among the findings that I've had has been looking at how narratives around feeling misunderstood or lost or isolated have been used to recruit particularly young teens and preteens in the United States, and how that has actually been the work of various generations, not just new, not just about the internet or through the internet. And so I look at this topic because I think it's super pertinent to what's happening today, and I want to make a better society for my generation and future generations. And I think that by doing this research and publishing it in the way that we do, we can better mitigate, because we can't mitigate a problem we don't understand.
Hi everyone, my name is Ryan Horio, and I'm a graduating senior at UCLA, dual majoring in Human Biology and Society and Asian American Studies, and I'm also getting a minor in Community Engagement and Social Change. My project talks about how anti-Asian hate during the pandemic affected racialized Asian American youth in 3 ways. 1, in their mental health, 2, their conceptualizations of identity, and 3, their introduction to activism. I chose to do this project specifically based on my own experiences during the pandemic, where I witnessed a lot of anti-Asian hate online. And that was really frustrating. Seeing people that could have been my grandparents or people that could have been my family members attacked based on their racial identity, I felt like I was powerless to do anything against it. Well, flash forward to now, I do have that power to do something. I strongly believe that my work as a researcher and community member will serve to mitigate hate against those in my community by uplifting youth voices and by telling institutions what supports that we need and needed during that time to better inform interventions in the future.
Hello everyone, this is Mukesh Kularia. I'm a graduate student at the Department of Ethnomusicology at UCLA. My project explored the impact of state-sponsored music initiative in collaboration with the grassroots organization in India, Rajasthan, which served as a mitigation strategy to counter religious hate. During my conversation with the different stakeholders, I found that people look at these syncretic traditions very differently. Some look at them as a shared common heritage, while others look at them as a partisan traditions. The reception of this music thus depends on the overall socio-cultural and political environment rather than independent of that. This music could work as a mitigator given the other aspect of harmony and justice are sincerely and diligently approached. And I've been part of this music festival since its inception in 2012, and I've been very closely associated with the festival community in Rajasthan. And I hope that my research brings out the music's capacity as a mitigator when it is embedded and allied with the broader rubric of socio-cultural, political, and governance geared towards harmony and justice. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. We are about to begin our third and final panel, but before we do, I'd like to just acknowledge a number of people who are with us in this audience who have been friends and partners in our work. They include our friends from the California Civil Rights Division, Alec, Kevin, David, thank you so much for being with us. Commissioner Professor Brian Levin from the California Commission for the State of Hate, one of the country's leading experts on the study of hate. Thank you for being with us, Brian. We have Sarah and Winnie, our good friends from the Pritzker Foundation, who have been supportive of our work for almost from the beginning. Thank you so much. And we also have Capri Maddox from the LA Civil Rights Department. Thank you so much for being with us, Capri. And we did have, I don't know if we still do, Alyssa Barrett from the Executive Director of the Western Justice Center, who was with us earlier, so Alyssa may come back, but it's been great to have her with us. As Amalia said, we will repair to the outside patio to continue the conversation when, as last year, we really had animated conversations about the content of the panel discussions, and I look forward to that. You're all invited. And I just also want to acknowledge before we move on further, members of the ISH community who are in the audience, please do stand and be seen. You are part of a really extraordinary research community. Josh, you're looking around, you're one. Mark, you're one. So thank you for being with us. Okay, so the final panel that we'll be hearing from is dedicated to the topic of studying hate in fraught times. And I think we can all agree both on the importance of studying hate and that we are in fraught times. This panel also has one of the great benefits of being, in some limited sense, multi-generational, in that it includes undergraduate students and researchers who have been with UCLA for a number of years longer than undergraduates, shall we say. And I really think that that's one of the really wonderful and extraordinary things about our ISH research community is that it includes this cross-generational conversation. All the more important when we talk about something like the study of hate in fraught times and really what animates you all. It's really important to understand what's animating not just senior researchers, but people at the beginning of their research careers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce everybody very briefly with a one-line bio, and then we're going to jump right in. So we'll go in alphabetical order, which is almost the way in which they're lined up. First, I'll begin with Cecilia, otherwise known as Celie Fisher, who is a fourth-year undergraduate studying history, Arabic, and Hebrew with a special focus on Jewish history and thought. Welcome, Celie. Then we have Yarin Chagai Nevel, who is a fourth-year undergraduate majoring in psychology. Ryan Horio is a double major in human biology and society and Asian American studies with a minor in community engagement and social change. Dr. Christine Ong is a research scientist at the Kress Center in the School of Education and Information Studies. And Dr. Lisa Luft is an assistant professor of sociology who studies decision-making about genocide. So welcome to you all. Let's jump right in. The first question is just to say a little bit more about yourselves and what you're doing related to ISH, and tell us a little bit about not just the project, but the method you're using. So I think, you know what, we're going to begin at the end and move this way. I'm going to give the microphone to Elisa.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'm Elisa Luft. I'm happy to be here and really honored to be a part of this community. So I study, as David mentioned, decision-making about genocide, and really I'm interested in how people make decisions to kill or not kill as a war is ongoing, and also how victimized populations respond and make decisions and strategize on how to protect themselves. I've studied such work in Rwanda. I'm completing a book on the Holocaust in France, and really central to my work is breaking apart our assumptions that once a killer, always a killer, or that victims always act in one way only and don't shape the trajectories of their own lives and fates and outcomes. And so as part of that, I'm really interested in breaking apart groupist assumptions that underlie a lot of research on genocide, which is this idea that victim and perpetrator groups always neatly overlap with the social categories central to the genocide. So in Rwanda, for example, the Hutu and Tutsi. As a result, a lot of what my work has been for ISH has been trying to understand social perceptions and misinformation on college campuses today with regards to anti-Semitism, Zionism, Islamophobia, and anti-Palestinian sentiment, trying to understand with David, with Salma Musa, and with Josh as well. We are trying to understand students' perceptions and misperceptions about this crisis, what they know, what they don't know, what they think others know, what they think others believe, to try and get a better grasp of the tumultuous times we're living in, and to move beyond the assumptions about what we think people believe so that we can try and heal those divides.
Before we pass on the microphone, it's just too interesting. I mean, tell us perhaps what's most important, what it's most important to be disabused about when it comes to understanding decision-making and genocide.
I think one of the most important things to be disabused about is sort of this notion, once a killer, always a killer, the idea that someone makes a decision, in many ways a violent decision, and are committed to that decision for the trajectory of a war, that people can't be turned away from violence, that their relationships before a war, before genocide, don't matter, but actually trying to understand first what drives people to kill. A gulf exists between a desire to harm and actually harming someone, so what happens in that gulf? That's what I'm really interested in. And then how can that same things pull people away? Really complicating this binary understanding we have about war and violence and decision making throughout.
Okay, hello. Very excited to be here. I am connected to ISH through the SMASH project, Social Media and the Spread of Hate, and I have some colleagues here, so raise your hands proudly. There we are. So wrong. Anyway, SMASH is a partnership. It's a collaboration with researchers in 2 departments on campus, Education, Information Studies, and we have a nonprofit partner, Organization for Social Media Safety. They're based in LA, but they do programming across the country. They provide assemblies for students grades 5 through 12, as well as parent programming, support in developing community guidelines. And so what we do is we help them analyze data that they gather through their programs. So for example, they have an assembly where they introduce or talk about social media harms, raising awareness about them, as well as providing them with strategies, students with strategies. And they'll ask questions during the assembly about, well, have you been cyberbullied? How much time do you think you spend on average on a given day on social media? And they'll answer with handheld clickers. We're able to analyze that data now. We have over 29,000 responses in 10 states. And so we're beginning to be able to look at patterns and lay a foundation for more in-depth studies looking at the impact of social media on mental health and learning. I'm also involved in a few small studies here on campus, one that's really just started. It's at the lab school, and it's around critical media literacy. So working with younger students, grades 3 and 4 to start, and promoting that idea, working with Fascination Lab, another UCLA affiliate. How can you share your ideas or propose or argue for a position and still be empathetic and kind in those and use evidence? And that's just starting out.
Okay, hold on. You have 29,000 respondents. What do you see?
Okay, that was question 3. No, I'll start. So just a few snapshots here. So 81%, so 8 in 10 of the kids are saying that they're seeing hate speech in the last month. Almost half have reported that they've been cyberbullied, and that matches pretty closely with some of the other studies like Pew. One thing we ask is about what was your emotional reaction, as well as what you did when you saw hate speech last. And so again, these clickers are crude, so it's a multiple choice question. That's why we're doing qualitative work as well. But about a third say that they felt no emotion, and often will say they're scrolling by. And that's where we're doing more qualitative research to understand, well, what does that really mean? And we're also finding, and this is the work of my colleagues, with more time spent or more average hours spent on social media, we're seeing increases in things like feeling no emotion or reporting no emotion.
Hi everyone, my name is Ryan. I'm a graduating senior here at UCLA, or undergrad senior here at UCLA. My research focuses on anti-Asian hate during the pandemic, looking at a retrospective and a critical ethnic studies lens, specifically in 3 ways. 1, in their mental health, 2, their conceptualizations of identity, and 3, their introduction to activism. So how did Asian American youth specifically react to the anti-Asian hate that was going on during the pandemic? As a lot of people understand the pandemic and COVID to be a kind of blip in time, for a lot of Asian American youth, this was not that, right? Things happened that, we didn't really see growing up, and so that really follows with you moving forward in those spaces to talk about those experiences, also thinking about Asian culture and, really suppressing those emotions doesn't really come up. So I wanted to give a voice to Asian American youth to share their experiences, and also how we can better support them in the future. Part of the questions that I asked in my interviews were, how would you like to be better supported by institutions, whether that was your community, whether that was your educational institutions or the government, and really see how we can be better to prevent something like this in the future and how we can mitigate the effects of hate.
Okay, right. Say a bit more about your method.
Yes, so I did interviews. I have around 12 hours of interviews across 5 different participants. I interviewed everyone 3 times to ask the breadth of questions. Given that we are talking about some very traumatic things based off what you witnessed or maybe even experienced during anti-Asian hate during the pandemic, it was really important that I wanted to establish rapport with my participants, really tell them, hey, I'm here to listen to your experiences, I'm here to share our stories, this is really important to me, and thank you for sharing. Across that, I did thematic analysis across all the transcripts of the interviews and really came up with 6 main themes of how Asian American youth really reacted to these events, and also what are they doing now in the contemporary, knowing what we know from the events that happened back then.
Hi everyone, my name is Yureen Hagai Neville, and I'm a 4th year psychology student here at UCLA in my undergrad. I am a PI for a mirrored study analyzing how different identity framings in the media impact Jewish and Muslim undergraduate students' identity valence. So essentially, identity valence means whether people will perceive being Jewish or Muslim or whatever their religious identity is as a positive thing or as a negative thing. And we were really interested in looking into this because ever since the beginning of the Israel-Hamas war, a lot of the media discourse right now in the news, both nationally and internationally, has been focusing on the experiences of undergraduate students, and specifically an overemphasis on Jewish students' experiences with anti-Semitism. And we noticed that no one was talking about what is being said, right? So we have all these statistics and analyses about anti-Semitic and sometimes Islamophobic experiences, but no one is talking about how all this attention and all these statistics is actually impacting the students themselves. So that is why we decided to do this study specifically, and I am a part of a wonderful team with my amazing friend Celie.
Hello. So I serve mainly as the research assistant in our project, which Irene has done the vast majority of work for, but I served as someone who helped develop the idea of the project. The project has taken several changes along its course in response to how events on campus have gone, and I think that something that's been really important is to understand, kind of also in my role as an intern for the Dialogue Across Difference Initiative, which is housed under the Vidari Kindness Institute, in addition to the Initiative to Study Hate, to understand how research like this is disseminated and shared among the undergraduate campus population whom we are studying. And so Yurine and I have worked very closely together throughout this whole process because we also work together on a campus club that promotes dialogue and education about this. And so this is very close to our futures and our work just in general in our lives, so.
Okay, great. On that point, say a bit more, Celia and Yurine, about what the motivation for this study was. You clearly were operating in a very fraught environment, to continue the theme of fraughtness. What did you say to yourself in applying and then receiving a grant? In terms of your motivation, what did you say to yourself? This is something I really want to do at this moment because I see this.
I'll start and then I'll pass it along. I think something that's so important for both of us is that this is unique in the fact that it's a mirrored study on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and it treats these things as interrelated in many ways, as in when one goes up, it also goes up for the other group. And so rather than looking at either one of these as isolated or unique, of course it is unique in its own ways, especially since they're such unique categories in the way that anti-Semitism, is it religious hate? Is it kind of peoplehood? Is it cultural? Is it political? And same with Islamophobia. Is it a religion, or is it also that people perceive Arabs and Palestinians on campus in a certain way? And so kind of navigating in how that is anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim sentiment on campus, and also anti-Semitism, and seeing that as, since I think it's something in our university system, in that the ways in which these things are addressed have a direct impact on students, and sometimes it can be addressed in unequal ways. So we wanted to look at these as interrelated.
Before Yurine mentions her motivations, I just want to remind people that although we had originally decided not to pursue the study of particular case studies after October 7th, we thought it imperative to take up questions surrounding anti-Semitism. And then we thought it would only really make sense to do that in the university environment we inhabit if we also understood better the phenomenon of Islamophobia and the related forms of identity-based hate and discrimination like anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian. So in addition to our monthly seminar that brings together members of the ISH community, we also have a monthly seminar for scholars devoted to the study of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And that has generated a great deal of very productive cross-fertilization that I think will really bear fruit for our campus and really, I think, nationally, in really kind of piercing through stereotypes about what A thinks about B, or what A thinks B thinks about A, which is really a cornerstone of what we're trying to to get at. So with that, Irene.
Yeah, so I had two motivations. One was personal and the other was organizational. I'm Jewish and Israeli American, and my entire family, except for my immediate family, lives in Israel, Palestine. And almost every single conversation that I've had with my parents, my grandparents, anyone that lives in Israel proper about my undergraduate experience has been, what's the anti-Semitism like? And that was really frustrating because there's so much more to my personal undergraduate experience except for this one, albeit very, very important part of my life. That was my personal motivation. On an organizational and an empirical scale, I noticed that most of the studies being done on anti-Semitism were politicized. And we really, really wanted to just have clean data and essentially, and we'll talk about this later, but find a way to make undergraduate experiences better for the sole purpose of making them better, not because there was any type of political motivation there.
Okay, we'll definitely get back to how apolitical you were able to make it. So, Ryan.
Yeah, my motivation, like Irene's here, was very personal, right, during the pandemic. Anti-Asian hate was really hard for me. I think that was the first time I really saw people that look like me getting attacked based on their race. You know, there's microaggressions, there's like, you know, structural racism, but I think blatant assault and attacks on Asian Americans was very hard for me to see because I thought about my grandparents. I thought about my mom, my sister, my dad, my brother. You know, what would happen if they're walking the street and something happened to them? I don't think I would be able to forgive myself for letting that happen, but then I realized, you know, it's a structural thing, it's a societal thing. And I really came to UCLA thinking I want to do something to combat this, right? I don't want to be, you know, part of the problem or be a bystander. I want to be active in being a part of the solution. So with my thesis, I really wanted to have tangible solutions from Asian American youth that are grounded in data from us, told by us, about what we wanted and what we needed to do to combat this. I guess this is a way for me to give back to my community in a way that I can kind of foster the next generation to really stand up for what we believe in and stand up for ourselves and to not just take it, I guess.
This is something you came to UCLA with a desire to do?
Yes, I came to UCLA. I wrote a lot of my personal statements applying to college about this. So I guess it's been in the making for 4 years. And I'm thankful for the ISH community for supporting it and everyone here. This has been something that I want to continue into my journey as a physician, right? Anti-Asian hate is really something, I guess it was a catalyst for me getting into activist work and really grounds a lot of my research now moving forward.
Thank you, Ryan. Christine.
And I feel so lucky to have these colleagues with such passion. Anyway, so I guess there are a couple things. So over the years, I've worked on a range of projects. So my background's in child development, so play has always been a real question for me in the role of technology. So from working at a museum and seeing someone touch that button 10 times, like what's happening, are they learning something, to more recently been involving in projects where kids are collecting data on an app to learn about big data. So there have been these threads of different types of studies that somehow connect to this project. There's also a conflict resolution program for young children. So that's, I think, how I was called to the meeting with OFSMS in the first place, as they began a partnership with the School of Education. Also a daughter, or I also have a daughter. I'm the mom of a teen daughter, and she begged for TikTok during the pandemic. And so as much as I think I understand or have read, I know as a parent how hard it is to navigate, even to have productive conversations. Sometimes I am able to, and sometimes still figuring out how to navigate this space with someone who's growing up as a native there.
Not to intrude too much, Christine, but have any of the findings that you have happened onto from SMASH been a benefit to you in offering advice to your daughter?
Yes, and I would actually say that she has been a font of insight, and so sometimes I'll share, like, here's what we're learning, or hey, have you heard about this? Here's what I'm hearing, and she'll be able to tell me much more. So it's provided an opportunity to have some really rich conversations, which I'm incredibly thankful for.
thank you. I'll try and be as brief as possible in terms of my motivation. I grew up a grandchild of 4 Holocaust survivors. I learned about the history of the Holocaust when I was 7. I have very vivid memories of my grandmother telling me about her entire family that was killed. All 4 of my grandparents, their entire families were just wiped out. And the hardest thing for them was just trying to understand how their neighbors all turned on them. From their perspectives, that was what happened. And so when I was an undergraduate, I became very, very involved in the Save Darfur movement. I spearheaded the Save Darfur organization on my campus. I organized fundraisers, I organized rallies. And then at some point it hit me, I have no idea what I'm talking about. I don't know Sudanese politics, I don't know Darfur politics, I don't know the history of this region, I have to learn more. And I also, around that time, found out that I was 12 when the Rwandan genocide happened, and I didn't know much about that either. So I kind of became obsessed with trying to understand similar dynamics in Rwanda. Trying to understand it with regards to my own family history was too close and too painful, and I didn't foresee having the clarity to understand that in the way that I thought I could with Rwanda. And so when I first went to Rwanda to interview people who participated in the genocide, which I very intentionally do not call perpetrators, I call them people who participated, because sometimes they didn't participate. I had this assumption that they participated because they hated the people they were killing, and this was a racialized hatred, very similar to Nazi Germany and the Holocaust racialized hatred of Jews. And so I was very surprised when speaking to these people who participated in the genocide to learn that they would tell me things like, on one day I killed 4 people, the next day I saved someone, the next day I refused to participate, the next day I killed again. And I became very obsessed with understanding what I call behavioral variation in genocide, how people make those decisions. Long story about how I ended up doing research on the Holocaust in France, which is not where my family is from, but studying sort of similar dynamics, decision-making about genocide. And then, of course, after 10/7, being at UCLA, being a Jewish person, being deeply sensitive for my entire life to the suffering of Palestinians, I felt like I was living in almost like 2 extremist worlds, from my family and the kinds of people I grew up with and the kind of community I grew up with. I was being exposed to one very extremist perspective on what was happening since 10/7, and from my academic community, my professional community, my sociological community, a very different extremist perspective of what was happening. Sometimes being on social media, it was just like whiplash back and forth between one post and another post and another post, and it was really painful, very isolating, trying to figure out my own views in light of my research. And so I think in a lot of senses, doing the project that I'm doing with Ish, the motivation was to try and bring my academic and intellectual understanding of how people make decisions about violence, always with the lofty goal, obviously, of making the world a better place, but I really see myself as a researcher and not as an activist. And lending that research to understanding what's happening in our community here at UCLA, which I care very deeply about. So that's my motivation.
So a common thread throughout all that you've described is a desire to complicate fixed categories.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, there are lots of questions I could ask about that, but I'm wondering sort of the holy trio of categories that emerged out of Holocaust research is the trio of perpetrators, victims, bystanders.
Yeah.
Do you altogether discard that
I
trio?
do. I really do. And there's some people add a 4th category of rescuers.
Because of the porousness between who a perpetrator is and a rescuer is.
Yes.
The same person on different days.
Exactly. The same person on different days. And sometimes victimized populations can perpetrate violence as well or be complicit in violence as well. So trying to understand what shapes those decisions. And if I begin from the standpoint of perpetrator, victim, bystander, I miss that variation altogether. So it's really important for me intellectually to do away with those categories and to just talk to human beings about the worst thing they ever experienced in their lives, whether as a victim of violence, whether as someone who participated in violence, whether as someone who did all those behaviors during a violent episode. And I do the same when I work in archives. I do a lot of historical and archival research, really trying to it's going to sound cheesy as an academic, but really trying to open my heart to the human experience. It's very emotional. I never clearly stop feeling those emotions, and try to humanize the person. You know, I say the subject, even saying that makes me feel badly, but trying to humanize the story of experience in war and violence. That's
So
like
that
central
work of
to
computation,
everything I
as
do.
we gather, is being brought to your understanding of what goes on here
Absolutely,
today.
yeah.
And I didn't think that this, the next question I'm going to ask you, and then I'm going to stop.
Okay.
It's a big one.
Oh, shoot.
And it's sort of off
Yeah,
the
okay.
path.
Yeah.
But just, we know each other, we work together. I've never asked you this. I mean, how do you understand, as the granddaughter of 4 Holocaust survivors, the idea of evil?
Oh.
As, like, is that a category that, a kind of ontological category that we should do our best
I'm
to
laughing
dissolve?
'cause David knows I have an almost 6-year-old, and I also have an almost 2-year-old, and my son is like the most incredible kid in the world. And he asks me questions like, evil, hatred,
I've
not in
channeled
those
6-year-old.
words, but like, are there bad people? I personally don't, I'm a sociologist, I personally don't believe there are many bad people in the world. I think people make bad choices. I think that a lot of those choices are driven by social, economic, political, structural factors. I think people can become hardened to the world around them. I think they can turn off compassion and love and open-mindedness and open-heartedness. I think that's very easy to do in the times we're living in. But I think, is there anyone purely evil? I would reserve that for a couple of people in the history of the world, and those are people I don't tell my child about yet. So.
Yeah, great, thank you for taking that on. All right, we're
One
going to
day
stay
he'll
with you
watch this
for
video.
now the next round, which is, and you've hinted at it, and we've lived it because we've talked about it a lot, but the fraughtness of the time, how difficult it has been at a personal level, and yet how that has been a motivation to try and understand better. So can you talk about what it's been like to undertake the research you're doing? You finished a brilliant book on the attitude of French Catholic officials during the Second World War, and have been involved in this ISH project that's gauging attitudes towards Jews, Muslims, Zionists, Palestinians, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. What's it been like? Has it been cathartic or like a psychic burden of immense weight?
It has not been cathartic. Thank you for saying that about the book. I was just talking to Erin that I'm waiting on reviews. They were supposed to come today. Hopefully you'll all see the book a year from now. Hopefully, that's what my editor says. So it's taken me 10 years to write this book. I've lost track of how many years I've been at UCLA because I had 2 kids in a pandemic, I like to say, so I've lost track. I took 8 years to get my PhD. I did 2 years of a master's program before that, 4 years in undergrad where I was studying genocide and political violence. And the reason why I say that is because it takes a really long time to do this work well. And hopefully I'm doing it well, but I think one of the things that has been hardest for me about living on these fraught times is it sometimes feels like everyone has an opinion and can share it in 30 seconds on TikTok and largely shapes the discourse and isn't reading the research. And there are people who have devoted their lives to this. I would like to imagine I'm one of them, but hopefully, so it hasn't been cathartic so much as it's been thinking about when to speak and how to speak and being very careful about that, because what I say is really, what I say in public forums and public venues about these kinds of things, it's so important to me to get it right. And so I think something that's been very difficult is cutting through the polarization and the extremism, including in my own communities, to try, I don't want to both sides it, I don't want to moderate it, but I also, I think that's been the hardest part, is seeing the extremism and the polarization and the closed-mindedness to actually listening to not, one, what other people have to say, and two, to what research has to say. It's, we were talking about this with the last panel, like the death of expertise, everything having to be in a 30-second soundbite. I think that's been tough. So hopefully some of it's getting through. I think there's potential, or else we wouldn't be doing this. I think the reason why we're doing the survey that we're doing is precisely to try and bridge those divides more. But it takes time, and it feels sometimes like we don't have time, so it's hard.
How about you, Christine? The sort of research in the time of fraughtness.
Sure. Well, there's layers and levels like you're talking about. And I'm sure many of you might have also gotten emails about terminations of grants. So, you know, I got one. And I know that I also have, yep, there you are. People are raising their hands. So just on a day-to-day basis, kind of not knowing where you'll go or what you'll encounter. It's very destabilizing. And also, I think behind that is a lot of the great work that's being funded is no longer there. So whether it's training new teachers, whether it's computer education or computing education for high schoolers that might enable them to begin to ask some very deep questions about who is in this space and why, and what does AI do for us, or what are the benefits, what are the challenges. They might not have that opportunity anymore. So that's one thing that I guess is very fraught. Just in terms of methodological challenges, one thing that we know is that gender identity is a really important part of this discussion in terms of what kinds of hate exposure encounters, things that kids are encountering on social media. We can't ask that question, partly because we have this device that really only allows for multiple choice, and what do we ask? But in certain places now, the categories that are recognized don't recognize the true experience. So there are just a lot of barriers and ways of questioning, and a great deal of fear and cruelty, which I think, coming from being a teacher, just you want to model for kids what you hope to see. And there's a lot in this world that is not a very good model right now.
So Ryan, you said that you came to UCLA already with the idea in mind, following the staggering rise in anti-Asian hate in the midst of in the aftermath of the pandemic. There's been intensification of the fraughtness of our political environment in recent months. What has actually the UCLA experience been like for you in terms of reshaping, sharpening your own desire to undertake the kind of work you came to UCLA with the intention of doing?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. I think the biggest thing that I think about now is how does everything that's going on really impact my research? So I started my career doing research in these kind of fraught times coming out of the pandemic, right? You know, that's kind of where it started for me. And now I have that kind of lens of like, this is kind of what I've been used to, and that's kind of ingrained into my research a little bit. So now I'm really wondering, what was it like to do this research maybe before the pandemic, before anti-Asian hate really happened, and before there were political divides that were really polarized and very different kind of, I want to use the word, it's very deep on both sides, right? I think when I think about that, the thing that comes to mind with my research is, how do we get to the root of what's going on? For me, anti-Asian hate, there was a big thing where I was like, okay, well, what quantifies anti-Asian hate? You know, is it the legal definition? Is it like inaction, a specific inaction? What does it mean? But then I realized in my research, I don't think that matters too much, because it's how it's perceived by Asian American youth, because that's what will affect the outcomes. Whether you conceptualize your identity or not, whether you have poor mental health outcomes or not, it's whether if you perceive that event as something that was hateful or not. So I think that's what I really tried to focus on here. And when we talk about hateful times, I think with the ICE deportations and with everything going on in the news, you know, our administration is fighting Harvard and attacks on education and budget cuts. I do see that in my research and the interviews I'm conducting. People, I think, are a little bit more nervous to say certain things. It's not, and that's really a shame, because I'm trying to get at your experiences as an Asian American youth, not in this idea of you're scared to say certain things because you just don't know who might find out or whatever, right? Even though, you know, we have IRB process, we have like a lot of safeguards against that. I think it's really sad because you're not getting at the root of what's going on because of these political or social or economic kind of divisions in our country.
I mean, this is a big question and an important methodological one, which is, well, put it in the form of a question. have you seen, you said you've sort of abandoned the task of coming up with a kind of solid definition and instead have chosen to listen to those who are victims. There's a certain danger in relying exclusively on self-reporting. People can be influenced by things they've heard from peers and feel, yeah, I think I've experienced that in a way that's different than what their peer experienced. So I'm just wondering if you felt that at all, and what we might do to guard against sort of some of the perils or frailties of the mechanism of self-reporting, which is admittedly an extremely important part of our understanding of what hate is.
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind is really kind of grounding my research in what has been done in the past, right? I know my study is kind of retrospective, so it's been 5 years since the pandemic, since 2020, right? And so some people may say, okay, what's the point in that? But I think really trying to connect the two, looking at it from a retrospective lens, does give a different nuance to the perspective. And then when I talk with my participants, I think I always try to also ask, okay, I'm not trying to invalidate their experiences, but I ask, okay, how did that make you feel? What was the event? Why do you believe that this had such an impact on you? And what I'm trying to get at the core of all these questions is really trying to understand the experiences of Asian American youth during this time, right? And I think relating to the self-reported part that you have, I think I really just lean on research that was conducted back then, and because obviously I can't conduct that right now, it's different, time variables, but I think that's the one thing that I try to do, lean on things that have been published already in the literature and really talking about those and talking with my professors and faculty advisors about that and really trying to work that.
Tell us what you think the single most important thing that you've found to date is.
I think the most important thing is the importance of ethnic studies in supporting youth in conceptualizing their identity and also how to react to things. A lot of the participants that I talked with said that their ethnic studies classes, whether it's Asian American, African American, Chicano-Chicanx studies, really did help them with contextualizing everything and really try to root their experiences in historical background. So things aren't just confusing anymore. They're not just like, why is this happening to me? No, we have a history of this in America, right? And that really helps with framing your mindset as, wow, this is happening, to, oh, no, I know this has been happening, and then that changes into activism. Because you see that, you connect these different points based on the classes and the education that you have. So again, going back to the Fraught Times part, attacks on education, not talking about race, being race blind, all of this stuff is very detrimental to not just the research that we do, but the implications that we're gonna have 5, 10, 15 years down the line. Because children in high school right now, or even in college, they might not get to take ethnic studies classes. And that has a profound impact on how you conceptualize impacts of hate and relating it to historical events.
Okay, this is a slightly underdeveloped thought, sorry. But the most difficult thing for our study specifically is that we wanted this study to benefit all of its participants. And right now, if we're looking at specifically Jewish undergraduate students or Jewish folk in the United States in general, we have so many divisions within the Jewish community, right? We have anti-Zionist, Zionist, non-Zionist, and then when we look at like the Muslim undergraduate community, the biggest thing is that there just isn't that much support. There just isn't that much attention being given to them. And so the really difficult thing for us was, how do we create a study that could actually benefit every single student within these two religious demographic groups, regardless of their political ideology? And that's a really big emphasis on our study, is to have Jewish and Muslim undergraduate participants from all across the political spectrum. And yeah, I think that might be one of the more difficult things. I think the other one is also doing this work, but also validating the research that is being done on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. It's incredibly important, but we believe that even more so important is to see people's identities as holistic and not just resulting in one specific experience, and specifically, in this case, negative.
Just tell us a little bit about where things are at with your study.
Yeah, one of the questions was, what is it like to be an undergraduate researcher? And at UCLA, the psychology department is incredible. However, IRB is complicated. And there's not much, essentially, if you want to run your own independent study, you have to kind of go through this like alternative education route, work with a grad mentor and a faculty advisor and all these things in order to go through all these processes where you know the statistics for it, but you don't know how to make a prolific study. So essentially, we are at a point where our study is a pilot study that I hope to expand in the summer. It's going really well. We actually already have a few correlational findings that do show that different identity framings do impact identity valence. We have positive, negative, and neutral framing right now. With positive framing, or let me start with negative. Negative framing essentially summarizes a lot of the discourse that's happening in national media. So it's like a little paragraph and it talks about rates of anti-Semitism / Islamophobia. So Jewish participants get text specifically regarding anti-Semitism. Muslim students get text specifically regarding like Muslim identity and Islamophobia. So we look at rates of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. We look at rates of isolation, and then we also look at loss of experiences. So it's a paragraph essentially summarizing different statistics and different experiences that Jewish and Muslim students have. Again, Jewish participants get the Jewish one, Muslim participants get the Muslim one. The positive framing is the inverse. So we talk about the benefits of being Jewish or Muslim in your undergraduate community. So essentially, the opportunities that you get from being Jewish or Muslim in university, like scholarship opportunities and things like that. And then our neutral framing doesn't actually talk about religious identity at all. So that's our pilot study, and then we have different measurements to measure positive valence and negative valence. So it's currently on Prolific. We're hoping to get 90 participants by the end of the week, but correlation is looking good.
Just
it's
a
working.
note for those who may not be familiar, IRB approval is that process by which universities and other research institutions require a degree of proven learning in order to undertake human subject research as a safeguard against the exploitation of human subjects, such as occurred, for example, in the infamous Tuskegee experiment. And it is a laborious process, often, and comes at the wrong time of the academic year sometimes. Okay, Celia.
Well, you asked earlier if this research was cathartic. I would say for me, it is, because I'm a history major. I wrote my own thesis on a particular Jewish theologian's historical philosophical response to Jewish-Christian reckoning after the Holocaust. And so it's been really fulfilling for me to work with Irina on this, because for me, what drives me to do this is that I see a large deficit on campus in terms of how we talk about this, how the administration addresses this. And when things happen on campus and articles get written in the Daily Bruin about this is anti-Semitic, this is Islamophobic, and people come to me and they say, what do you think? It's cathartic and fulfilling for me to be able to say, well, my friend and I were actually working on a study that examines Islamophobia and anti-Semitism as interrelated concepts. And when I see that our university has a task force to address anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli sentiment, which it should, but not too much to address what Arab and Muslim students are experiencing and feeling on a daily basis, people in my classes, people who are my friends who don't feel protected, when I work in a dialogue initiative that seeks to bring people together, and yet people are afraid to engage in dialogue because they feel like they're not being protected from hate, to actually be able to work on something that examines these concepts. And hopefully once we're done, I think this is maybe a coming question, but actually be able to disseminate that to our administrators, to things like Campus Halals, Campus Muslim organizations, people that work on interfaith efforts, and be able to say, this is looking at Muslim and Jewish students as holistic people, rather not just articles written about us and how we're feeling and the divides and the hate that goes on, but rather actual statistics about how we're feeling I'm really looking forward to that. I'm really looking forward to being able to talk about this more, and the fact that I am able to talk about it and am supported in doing that.
Okay, I want to ask the three people to my immediate right what it has been like as undergraduates to engage in research of this nature. I mean, you wrote a thesis, but I'm thinking in particular about the ISH community and other communities. What has it been like? I mean, it isn't always the expectation that you will conduct your own research. So what's that been like for you?
Well, I would just say that something that's been really interesting for me is having more access to social psychological concepts. And so that's something that myself, when I engage with Israel and Palestine, with my friends, with my community, with other people, I'm able to say things like, I am going to try to understand this, and I am allowed to try to understand this, and that doesn't mean that I'm condoning it. And that can go from either way, because I often feel like those two things are conflated. But I think that's something that's really important to me, that is just, yeah, the quest of understanding.
Okay, we've heard about the more burdensome parts of being a researcher of any sort when facing IRB. What else has it been like?
Yeah, I think on an institutional level, I've just been incredibly lucky. Just being in the initiative to study hate, we've both been a part of the initiative, I think, for more than a year now. It's just been incredible to be undergraduate students and be able to sit in an interdisciplinary room and hear about all these amazing professors and researchers and discuss with them, right? Like usually undergraduate students, you know, you don't even really work with your faculty advisor, you work with a grad mentor. And so to be able to sit in that same room has been an immense privilege and probably one of the highlights of my undergraduate career. And additionally, I do social psychology, and I think that something that's really amazing about social psychology is that everyone kind of has like a neutral, like it's not political usually to be doing these studies, right? Like we're trying to better the world, and we're trying to look at it as empirically as possible. And I have personally gotten nothing but support from my amazing lab that I work with, from other students that I've shared my thesis with, because this is also my thesis. So it's been an amazing experience personally. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think also to echo that sentiment, you know, it's every month we have like our monthly-ish meetings, and every single time I'm like, wow, I'm so privileged to be here. I mean, Christine will say something, and I'll be like, whoa, I didn't even think about that. Or like David will like bring up like another conceptualization of hate, and I'm like, wow, right? It's just being at this age, right? I'm 22 years old. I'm about to go into maybe, you know, graduate. I'm getting so many different experiences here that I think are so valuable that I wish other people had too, right? I think people in my classes, people that I grew up with, because I learned so much in this space, so I want to give thanks there. But I think when we're doing research at this age, it's fun. It's like so fun, guys. Like I'll be honest, like, you know, being able to do this work on a community, with a community that I really care about, that was based off my experiences, I didn't know you could do this. I really didn't. I thought research, I'm a STEM major, and also I'm like half STEM, half humanities, but I thought research was just wet lab, biology, mice, you know, all that stuff. But no, research is anything. And from the amazing kind of interdisciplinary-ship that we have here at ISH, like I realized it could really be anything that you want as long as you're passionate about it and as long as you have a motivation to do it. And I think that is very validating, that my research is important, and that we can really do some great things with it in terms of creating sustainable change for our communities. I think that's the biggest thing that I've learned with ISH, and you know, it's been really awesome. And to have this experience as an undergrad, I'm like, wow, I'm going to grad school next year, and I'm really excited. I'm really excited to really take what I learned here into that program and beyond.
Thank you, Ryan. So I think we have time for a question that I'm going to pose to Christine and Elisa, and it's one that we had discussed, and I'm sure there are many ways you can go about answering it, but what repair do you seek in your work?
Repair. I guess thinking back to some of the results that I've shared, and another aspect of our work is we've also piloted a survey with undergraduates about their experience. They're able to reflect upon their middle school and high school years and their use of social media as well, ask some of the same questions. One thing that sticks with me is there's a question about, have you talked or do you remember speaking with an adult about being safe on social media in middle school or high school? And we have a few different questions, whether it be your parent or a teacher, any adult. And about a quarter say that they can't really remember an experience like that. That stands out to me, like, wow, there are a lot of people who, maybe that's not, it's a self-report, but there are a lot of people who cannot remember a conversation. And in our interviews, oftentimes what they'll say is, oh yeah, it was all about don't do this, don't do that. And then I think about my role as a parent, what I'm seeing in terms of sometimes programming or educational materials. So I think, I don't know if I'm answering the repair question as much as a big hole, a big gap that really, I think working together is going to be the only way, that we need to have a lot more conversation and focus, and integrate some of these very key concepts, whether it's perspective taking, empathy, media literacy, into all aspects of our learning, ideally.
So nice. I'm just thinking about my kids growing up in this like social media ecosphere and what we can do. What repair do I see? I'm an optimist by nature, which you know, I always sort of considered a blessing. Maybe after finishing my book, I'm rethinking some of that, which isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing. I don't see any other choice. Like I'm the kind of person who's like, we have to see each other's full humanity. Like there's really no other choice. There's nowhere to go but in that direction, unless we want to create more harm, unless we want to create more violence and more suffering, and that's not what I want. So what repair I see is hopefully just the repair of like bringing people back to the table. If we can just bring people back to the table, we can start that first step of seeing people in their full complexity, their full humanity. We don't have to agree. And I know for some people it can be really violent to sit across from someone who believes the polar opposite of what you do, and in some cases even believes that people like you deserve to be victims of violence and victims of suffering. But I just don't see any other direction to go in. So there has to be repair. It has to be there. And I want to be a part of that. So that's all I'll say.
As I think you've had a chance to see, these are 5 extraordinary human beings and researchers. And it's been such a pleasure to be in conversation with you. Thank you so much. In just a minute, repair to the patio outside to continue the conversation, but I do want to just recognize someone whom we've not yet had a chance to recognize, Mark Lee Cambray from the LA County Anti-Racism, Diversity and Inclusion Initiative is with us. Thank you so much for being with us. And with that, again, I want to thank the incredible ISH staff for pulling off today as seamlessly as they have. Thank you. And let us continue the conversation outside.